When we last left off, the meta was in a state of flux. Following the release of Docs and the subsequent ban list that took everything pre-core out of the meta, Cosmo was left the lone wolf at the top of the meta, with a couple of pendulum brews starting to pop up here and there under the name of Pepe, short for Performapal Performage. Those piles had grown substantially in power too with the release of the Master of Pendulum structure deck, bringing Pendulum Magicians and support for Performapal and Odd Ice, allowing the strategy to rival and even surpass Cosmo in the meta. But this was kept exclusively to the regional level, as the only potential YCS to showcase this was cancelled at the end of 2015. Because of this, Pepe would have to show its growth following the next core set release, and to anyone who knows about Pepe, this set would instantly make the Pendulum Magician pieces obsolete. Breakers of Shadow. Release date, January 15th, 2016. Set type, Core Set. Major strategies, Performapal, Draco Slayer, Cosmo. Impact. You're gonna die, clown! Bosch is probably one of the most infamous sets of the Arc 5 era, which is kind of funny in retrospect, as on the surface, it doesn't look like it would shift too much. No major revolutions in new archetypes, a couple of pieces of support for existing ones, but nothing as game warping as you'd expect from a set that caused a Tier 0 takeover. In reality, the set may have only had a bunch of smaller pieces for various strategies, but all of those smaller pieces could be utilized by the same centralized pile at the center of the meta, which would result in a complete hostile takeover of Pepe on the format as a Tier 0 mega threat, arguably the worst we've seen since Teledad. Let's start with the aforementioned Performapals, who saw 3 pieces of relevant support here. Monkey Board is a scale 1 that searches a Performapal the turn it's scaled, which in practice means that Monkey Board on its own was full pendulum scales, as it covered the low scale and allowed you to search for a high scale such as Lizard Draw or the new scale 6 of Guitardal, who draws a card when the Performapal scale is activated while it's already in scale. This would be extremely useful alongside Lizard Draw specifically, as you could scale the turtle, scale Lizard to draw 1 off the turtle, then send Lizard for its effect to draw 1, effectively giving you a Pot of Greed style effect. Lastly, Performapal Pendulum Sorcerer was an OCG import that, on special summon, popped up to 2 cards you control to search for Performapals up to the number of cards you popped. This was an incredibly powerful effect that standardly would let you pop scales to search for either follow-up or the Lizard Turtle combo, but there was a pretty major oversight on this particular card. On its initial release, Pendulum Sorcerer was mistranslated, stating that it searched up to the number of monsters destroyed, not cards. As such, because it happened at the same stage of the effect as the pop, if you popped your scales with this effect, it would consider the pop cards as spells, meaning you wouldn't get the search off. This would be a pretty major nerf to the card's applications, specifically in regards to popping cards like Plushfire in the scale, which was a very common play at the time due to Plushfire's float effect. Buster Blader would be the newest attempt at retraining a monster used by Yugi, giving us the Destruction Sword Master, who's treated as Buster Blader on the field and in grave, equips opponent's monsters destroyed by battle to himself, and can send an equipped monster to grave to pop all same type monsters the opponent controls, as well as the Whelps, a series of Dragon Tuner companions for Buster Blader. Buster Whelp would be the main one, able to search a Destruction Sword card on normal, contribute itself to summon Buster Blader from hand or grave, and can summon itself from grave by discarding a Destruction Sword card if you control Buster Blader. This was a quick and easy way to access one of the deck's primary bosses, being Dragon Destroyer Swordsman through a search for Fusion, a quick play spell that can recur itself by discarding any card. When Fusion summoned, gains 1000 attack for every dragon in the opponent's field or grave, swapping all dragons to defense, locking their effects, and gains piercing. Or the Synchro Buster Dragon, who turns all opponent's monsters into dragons, can summon a Buster Blader from grave if you do not control one, and can equip a Destruction Sword monster from grave to Buster Blader once per turn, being effectively a companion piece for the anti-dragon bosses. As for the other Whelps, each can equip from hand or field to a Buster Blader, with each having a Floodgate effect and an effect that moved the Whelp off of Buster Blader for an immediate bonus, with Dragon Buster locking the opponent's special summons from extra deck and can summon itself while equipped, Wizard Buster locking the opponent's grave effects and can send itself to grave to recur a Destruction Sword monster, and Robot Buster locking face-up spell and trap effects and can send itself to grave to boost the equipped monster by 1000 for the turn. This would be an extremely comprehensive and solid wave of legacy support for Buster Blader, giving the deck a solid direction, but it suffered pretty heavily from the retrain not having the name Buster Blader in hand or deck, meaning half of the support couldn't be used with it until the retrain was on the field or in the grave, leading to the deck bricking to high heaven more often than not, although it would see rogue level play in formats with high dragon representation for obvious reasons. Draco Slayer would receive easily its most impactful support yet, receiving another Draco Slayer main deck name in Master Pendulum, being a normal pendulum that can pop another pendulum scale on field while it's in scale, and the fusion boss of Dinostar Power, a contact fusion of a Draco Slayer pendulum and any other pendulum, can revive a Draco Slayer pendulum once per turn, and blocks all pendulum cards you control from destruction of any kind. However, there was one more piece of support this time that would take Draco Slayer over the top, being Draco Face Off, a quick play spell that revealed a Draco Slayer and a Takeover Lord from deck, had the opponent select one at random, and then the selected monster could either be special summoned or set in the scale with the other moving to the extra deck. This was insanely powerful, giving you easy access to your luster lines at best, or at worst giving you a free level 4 body and vector pendulum while placing luster in the extra deck for the eventual pendulum summon back, making this an absolute staple for all pendulum decks moving forward. Dynomist would be the third Draco Slayer tie-in archetype, a series of level 4 and 5 machine pendulums focused on protection and scales, with all the low scales being able to destroy themselves in place of another Dynomist card, and all the high scales being able to negate a card that targets a Dynomist by popping itself, with each having unique monster effects, with Stegosaur popping both sides of any combat involving another pendulum you control, Plesios dropping the opponent by 100 for each Dynomist card you control, Petaran searching a Dynomist when it destroys a monster in combat, Brachion able to summon itself from hand if your opponent has the highest attack on field and you control no Brachions, Ceratops able to summon itself from hand if you control only Dynomists and no Ceratops, and Rex able to tribute a Dynomist at end of damage step it attacks to either attack again with piercing or spin back a card from the opponent's hand or field and gain 100 attack. They also had two relevant spell traps in Charge, which searched a Dynomist on activation and added a Dynomist sent to face up extra deck back to hand once per turn, and Rush, which summons a Dynomist from deck, making it unaffected by card effects and destroys it in the end phase. While Dynomist was absolutely interesting and constructed, it didn't have what it needed to compete on the meta stage consistently, being relegated to the rogue level at best. Shiranui would be a new zombie archetype aimed at cheating out their synchros with their tuner Spectral Sword, who can banish itself in another zombie non-tuner engrave to summon a zombie synchro whose total level equals the 2. This would be complemented by their main deck pieces of Smith, who search the Shiranui card when sent to grave as synchro material and prevent zombie battle destruction the turn he's banished, Spirit Master, who summons a Shiranui from hand on normal and pops a card when banished, and Samurai, who can banish a zombie from grave to boost itself by 600 and banish any monster it battles that turn, and recurs a Shiranui monster when banished. Their synchro bosses here were Samurai Saga, a level 6 that can shuffle back a banished zombie to swap all opponent's monsters to defense with less attack than the returned monsters, and drops an opponent by 500 when banished, and Shogun Saga, a level 8 that banishes a zombie from grave on summon to boost itself by that monster's attack, and floats into a banished zombie with 0 defense on destruction. Shiranui had the bones of an interesting strategy for sure, unique way of utilizing the standard zombie shtick of filling up the grave and recursive payoffs, but unfortunately was just not consistent enough at this juncture to become meta, seeing some rogue level experimentation with Unizombie for helping set up Spectral Sword lines. Cosmo would see its third wave of support here in Tin Can, a pilot who can pay 500 to choose 3 Cosmo cards from deck, then add 1 at random to hand while dumping the other 2 to grave, Sword Troopers, a pilot who can pay 1,000 to revive a pilot in grave, Delta Shuttle, a ship that can dump a Cosmo from deck to grave to drop a monster's attack by its level times 100, Dark Eclipser, a ship that can't be targeted and can banish a Cosmo monster from grave to negate traps, notably not floating into a Cosmo on death, rather searching one instead, and Cosmojo, a trap that pops a Cosmo to non-targeting banish a card on field. This wave would spark an interesting change in direction for Cosmo's deck building over the next couple of months, mainly centering around the new pilot of Tin Can, as by using its effect, one could actively set up the grave with multiple ships and then revive them using cards like Call the Haunted and Oasis of Dragon Souls. This direction of the deck's building style would receive the colloquial name of Tin Can Turbo, and while it wouldn't be super popular for now, it would fundamentally shift Cosmo's place in the meta over the coming months with new releases and the strategy's last support wave. Kaiju would receive their most interesting support wave yet, receiving Chizukiru, the now strongest Kaiju body at 3300, but also a new reason to actually play it. Interrupted Kaiju Slumber was effectively Dark Hole that summoned 2 Kaiju from deck, 1 to each side of the field, and could be banished from grave grave on the following turn to search another kaiju. This would spark a movement of using the kaijus as an engine that was effectively Dark Hole but better, wiping the board and giving you an immediate 1100 damage to push to the opponent by attacking over the Gamma Seal with Jizukiru, then being able to search another Gamma Seal on a following turn to out whatever the opponent built after. Magispector would receive a more minor support wave here in Ogama, who sets a Magispector spell trap from deck on summon, and Sonics, which doubles a Magispector's attack and defense, but halves the damage it inflicts that turn. These two would find a home in Magispector decks namely for the added flexibility they gave to Magispector setups, with Ogama providing a search for either pool of responses the deck had access to. Guiding Ariadne could, when destroyed, reveal 3 counter traps in deck to have the opponent pick one to add to your hand, shuffling the rest back in. This would be yet another option for Pepe, as not only could it potentially search Solemn Warning if the opponent was daring enough to give it to you, but also the new counter trap of Solemn Strike, which can negate and destroy either a monster effect or inherent special summon for the cost of 1500 life points, being a massive staple in the meta almost immediately thanks to it being a way to block pendulum summon pushes. Another option was the more budget-friendly Ultimate Providence, which was an Omni-Negate at the cost of discarding the corresponding card super type from hand, which would see some experimentation. Twin Twisters was yet another variant of MST, taking a discard to use but popping up to 2 spell traps instead. This would be an instant staple, especially in a metagame centered around pendulums, as the versatility of being able to snipe both scales or remove multiple back row threats while also potentially setting up the grave was too good of a deal to pass up for most players, seeing mass play almost immediately. Quaking Mirror Force was the third of the elemental variants of the classic Mirror Force, flipping any affected monster face down permanently instead of destroying them, seeing experimentation immediately as the ability to lock up the opponent's zones with this was actually surprisingly useful. Fiendish Rhino Warrior was an OCG import that blocked other fiends from being destroyed, able to bin a fiend from deck when sent to grave, being an instant staple in Burning Abyss as it blocked the BA self-pop and let you Foolish Burial 1 after using it. Neptibus, the Atlantean Prince, could send an Atlantean from deck to grave to search an Atlantean card and can, if sent to grave for a water monster effect, revive an Atlantean monster. This piece would completely revamp Atlantean, or more accurately Merlantean, into a rogue-level contender for the current metagame, as by sending Dragoons with his effect, you could not only search another Dragoons, but also search for a Mermail to pair with it, being the perfect starter for the strategy. Lastly would be 2 new Exceeds in the OCG import slots that would revitalize the staple rank 4 pool in extremely different ways. Traptrix Rafflesia is unaffected by traps while she has materials, and could detach to send a trap hole from deck to grave when its effects would be able to be applied to trigger that effect. Rafflesia would become an instant staple rank 4 in the format in large part thanks to Treacherous Trap Hole, as her effect became a 2 monster pop on a quick effect with that, seeing use for that as well as for applying Bottomless after the fact. The other, and far more interesting application card, was Cyber Dragon Infinity, a light-locked 3-material rank 6 that can also summon itself over Cyber Dragon Nova, gains 200 attack for each material, can suck up an attack position monster on either field as material once per turn, and can detach one for an Omni-Negate. You may be remembering what I said right at the start of this, and no, I did not misspeak. Cyber Dragon Infinity would be a staple piece of the rank 4 toolbox due to a monster we've mentioned before in our series, being Tellarknight Ptolemaeus, who could, for the cost of detaching 3 materials, rank itself up into any light rank 5, which just so happens to allow access to Cyber Dragon Nova, which in turn gives access to Infinity. This would become an integral part of any rank 4 focus deck that could reliably put up 3 materials, which in case you didn't know, was about to become frighteningly common as we entered a tier 0 format with YCS Sydney would be the first event of the year on January 16th, and Pepe was already poising itself as the new mega threat, taking 90% of the known top cut. With all of the new tools from Bosch, the deck was an absolute menace, as you could set up any number of various turn 1 setups with a deck ranging from Rafflesia to Infinity to Dweller to even Nightmare. Not to mention the follow-up you had with options like Castell, Ignister Prominence, or Trapeze Magician. At this stage, there were so many different options for the strategy that practically every list would be running something different. Some would run Rescue Rabbit as a way to access Master and Vector for Exceed plays and Dinosaur power lines. Some would run Odd One of Tex and the Reptile lines for searching with King of the Feral Limps, such as Palomuro for access to Naturia Beast with Hat Tricker, or Mask Chameleon to access Ignister Prominence with a Graved Master or Vector, and I'm sure many many others that were sadly not known due to the loss in most of this event's coverage, but we'll talk more about these soon. Yaowei Zhang would take the event on Pepe, using a fairly standard list with no particular standouts in deck composition or interesting techs, just utilizing the insanely consistent Menace. An extremely interesting part of the Pepe mirror match that should be discussed here is the interactions of Wavering Eyes, as timing your usage of the spell was critical for winning the mirror. The option had always been weighed on whether or not to use it on turn 1 for your own scales to get the benefits before your opponent can, or to save it for the full 4 scales, or save it to chain to your opponent's copy to ensure yours landed first. This was also complicated even further by the inclusion of Perform Age Damage Juggler, which could actually be discarded to completely negate Wavering Eyes due to the 1-pop effect being a burn effect, which only added to the mind game complexity of the mirror. The only non-Pepe deck that was known that topped here in the Tier 0C was Cosmo Artifact, being one of the first major appearances of Artifact Scythe in the meta as a way to block the massive Pendulum Flood back swing, able to be summoned the old-fashioned way with Sanctum, or with Slip Rider popping it off of a pilot tag out. This event would set the stage for the absolute dominance of Pepe on the format, but it seemed something else was just on the horizon, with the structure deck releasing 2 weeks later bringing forward a revolutionary idea for structure decks that would change their design forever. Emperor of Darkness. Release date January 29th, 2016. Set type Structure Deck. Major strategies Monarch. Impact Stunner Swarm. You decide. Emperor of Darkness in the OCG was the beginning of a new structure deck series known as Structure Deck R, which took the concept of an older structure deck, in this case the Dark Emperor, or Advent of the Emperor in the OCG, and revitalizing the idea into an entirely new design space, aimed at making the previous structure deck viable in the current meta landscape. This concept's first outing would be quite the impactful one, revitalizing the Monarch strategy with a number of new additions. Idea and Eidos would be new low-level additions, with Idea on summon specialing an 800/1000 from your deck, and when sent to grave returns a banished Monarch spell trap to hand, and Eidos giving you an additional tribute summon the turn it's summoned, and can be banished from grave to summon an 800/1000 from grave. Both of these would fuel the new bosses of Aether and Erebus, with both being able to be tribute summoned over any single tribute summoned monster. Aether able to tribute summon itself in the opponent's main phase by banishing a Monarch spell trap from grave, and able to summon a 24/1000 from deck by dumping 2 Monarch spell traps from deck to grave on tribute summon, and Erebus able to dump 2 Monarch spell traps on tribute summon to spin away a card from hand, grave, or field the opponent controls, and able to discard a Monarch spell trap while in grave to recur back a 2400 or higher attack and 1000 defense monster in grave. The Monarch spell traps would also see an overhaul in Pantheism, which discards a Monarch spell trap to draw 2, that can be banished from grave to reveal 3 Monarch spell traps in deck to have the opponent pick one to add to your hand. The Prime Monarch, a continuous trap that can shuffle 2 Monarch spell traps from grave back into deck to draw 1, and can, while in grave, banish a Monarch spell trap to revive itself as a level 5 Light Fairy, and Domain, a field spell that boosts your tribute summoned monsters by 800 while attacking, can reduce a 28/1000's level by 2 in hand for the turn, dropping their tribute summon requirement by 1, and, while you have no cards in your extra deck and a tribute summoned monster on the field, locks the opponent from special summoning a monster from the extra deck. To say this wave would make Monarch's meta was an understatement, seeing the deck surge in playability with new draw and search tools, new board flooding, and new bosses worth the tribute requirements, with Aether in particular being a house of a card thanks to being able to summon Curaz with her effect, which is one of the only 2400 Monarchs that does something on special summon, popping 2 cards on field and giving their controllers the ability to draw 1 for each. Domain, though, would cause some very heavy concessions in the base build as it was designed, as giving up your extra deck not only reduces your options in any scenario, but also flags to your opponent exactly what deck you are playing. When starting a match, the count for your extra deck is public knowledge prior to deciding who goes first or second, which in turn tells the opponent prior to the game starting that you are definitely on a Domain deck. On top of that, Domain Monarch was a bit of a brick fest, as unless you saw Pantheism early or a way to quickly tribute summon one of the new bosses, the deck's options were heavily limited, and with no extra deck to back it up, that could leave one dead in the water. That isn't to say the deck wasn't powerful, as it was, being one of the only strategies that could actually compete with Pepe in its hostile takeover, just not on a consistent basis. But there was another version of Monarch waiting below the surface that would arise within a few months that would be a far more powerful threat than Domain builds, in almost every aspect. YCS Atlanta would be held a week later on February 6th, and That's right, Pepe had hit the most representation in a top 32 cut a deck had ever had at this point in history, and it was clear to see why. Pendulum as a strategy in general was rampaging as the tipping point had clearly been hit, seeing so many viable options that the strategy had already displayed in Sydney a couple weeks ago alongside some new ones. Guiding Ariadne would be a tech that saw success thanks to searching for Solemn Strike or Warning when popped by Luster Pendulum or Wavering Eyes, giving another layer to the end board of the rank 4 toolbox. Dark Pepe would also be a variant that rose here thanks to Armageddon Knight and Zephyros the Elite, as you could bounce your Luster Pendulum back with Zephyros to not only enable rank 4s, but also to get additional Luster pops with cards like Plushfire, pushing the swarming even further. Jose Lagunas would take the event on Pepe, notably opting to not load up on any fancy techs, but rather hand traps like Valor and Maxi to give himself a fighting chance going second. Monarch would manage to take 2 top spots here, but falling completely out by top 16, with Majesty's Fiend being the big counterpick for the various pendulum swarming effects while Domain blocked the spam outs. Cosmo would also squeak in a single top spot here, notably playing Anti-Spell in the main to potentially block out the pendulum scales, as pendulums cannot be set at all, locking the zone from being used. It was clear that Pepe was a menace and needed to be dealt with, and interestingly enough, Konami would deal with it in the most bizarre way we've seen yet. Back on February 4th, Konami would release a blog post to their official site, notably including what they were referring to as an adjusted list that took effect directly following YCS Atlanta on February 8th. This list would be enforced for all official events at the regional level and above, but leave it as optional for all card shops, allowing them to keep the previous list without losing their OTS status. The adjusted list would make 6 hits in total, being 3 bans and 3 limits, all targeted at Pepe, banning Plushfire, Damage Juggler, and Ptolemaeus, and limiting Skullcrabat Joker, Monkey Board, and Luster Pendulum. This was a massive kneecap to the strategy, as the Performage engine as it was died with this list, leaving the only real option still worth considering being Trick Clown for certain strategies, as well as the death of Infinity's usage in rank 4 decks. However, this would not be the end of Pendulum, as the strategy was still left with plenty of options to rebuild with, and that would be helped along by the announcement of an errata to Pendulum Sorcerer, correcting its mistranslation and now letting it search for all cards popped rather than just monsters, fixing its major error. This would leave the game in completely uncharted territory, with the vast majority of shops adopting the adjusted list immediately due to it dealing with Pepe's oppression, with only a handful not adopting it, leaving most to question why the list was done this way at all, leaving the entire community to watch the next couple of set releases and events to see what direction the game would take. Wing Raiders. Release date, February 12th, 2016. Set type, deck building set. Major strategies, Phantom Knight, Raid Raptor, Super Quant. Impact, a new hybrid threat will rise. Wing Raiders would be the third attempt at bringing the deck building set concept to the masses, and it would not disappoint, bringing 2 new archetypes and the main block of support needed for an existing one. Raid Raptor was the existing archetype, debuting back in Secrets of Eternity, consisting of a series of level 4 winged beasts aimed at Exceed summoning, then repeatedly ranking up into their more impressive bosses with rank up magic spells. Tribute Lanius can dump a Raid Raptor card from deck the turn it summoned, and search as a rank up magic in main phase 2 if it destroyed something in battle that turn. Lastrix can summon itself when a Raid Raptor battles and you have a spell or trap on field or in grave, and contribute itself to summon a Raid Raptor Exceed from extra deck with its effects negated, returning it in the end phase. Forstrix is a rank 4 that can detach to search a level 4 Darkwing Beast. Satellite Cannon Falcon is a rank 6 that can Feather Duster the opponent if summoned with a Raid Raptor monster, blocks responding to that effect, and can detach to drop an opponent by 800 attack for every Raid Raptor in grave. Call can summon a Raid Raptor with the same name as one on field from hand or deck, and Soul Shave Force can pay half your life to revive a Raid Raptor Exceed, then rank it up into a Raid Raptor 2 ranks higher. While absolutely interesting support, easily the most eye-catching of this support for general use was Forstrix, as its search was fairly generic, in the current meta being able to search Zephyros. But in Archetype, the talking point was absolutely Soul Shave Force, being the best rank-up magic the archetype had seen thus far, with Satellite Falcon now being a desired target to summon with it for back row nukes, but overall would still leave Raid Raptor on the fringes of rogue play, barely scratching the surface. Phantom Knight was a series of haunted articles of clothing, with each having an effect that banished themselves from grave for some form of access to the deck. Ancient Cloak on field can boost a dark by 800 by swapping itself to defense, and can banish itself from grave to search the Phantom Knights card, which is effectively the monster line. Silent Boots can special summon itself from hand if you control a Phantom Knight, and can banish itself from grave to search a Phantom Knight spell trap, and Ragged Gloves gives a Dark Exceed made with it 1000 attack, and can banish itself from grave to dump a Phantom Knights card from deck to grave. The payoff for these is Break Sword, a rank 3 that can detach one to pop a card on each field, and if destroyed can revive 2 Phantom Knights of the same level, boosting their levels by 1 each, meant to tie in their anime users' boss monster of Dark Rebellion Exceeds Dragon from new challengers. Their traps fall into 2 categories, those that summon themselves as monsters, and those that can be banished from grave to revive a Phantom Knights monster, with Fogblade able to negate a monster's effect on field and blocking it from attacking or being attacked, Sword boosting a monster by 800 and destroying itself to protect its monster, and Wings boosting a monster by 500 and giving a one-time destruction prevention that turn. With this support, Phantom Knights would immediately see experimentation as a rank 3 strategy, with the main line giving access to rank 3s and Fogblade, being effectively a searchable fiendish chain, though its true home in the meta would be discovered shortly after. Lastly were the Super Quants, a series of Power Ranger-inspired monsters and their mechs, each being a different level and having a corresponding exceed of the same rank. Red Layer is the level 5, can special summon itself if you control no monsters, recurs a Super Quant card on summon, and if sent to grave revives a Super Quant other than itself. Green Layer is the level 4, summons a Super Quant from hand when summoned, and when sent to grave can discard a Super Quant to draw a card. And Blue Layer is a level 3, able to search a Super Quant on summon, and when sent to grave can shuffle back 3 Super Quants from grave. Their mechs all share an effect to attach a Super Quantum monster from hand or field to themselves once per turn, and cannot attack unless they have material, with Grand Pulse able to detach to pop a spell trap, Ouroboros able to detach to flip a monster on field face down, and Magna Liger able to detach to pop a monster, with all 3 able to use these effects as quick effects if their corresponding Super Quantum is attached. Super Quantal Fairy Alphon is the enabler for the deck, able to make all monsters you control levels match that of a Super Quant on field, and contribute itself to reveal 3 different Super Quant monsters in deck, then have the opponent pick one at random to special summon to the field while putting the others in grave. Their field spell Magna Carrier can discard a card to exceed summon a Super Quantum into its corresponding mech any number of times in a turn, but more importantly, if you have all 3 Mech Beast Exceeds on field or in grave, can send itself to grave to use all 3 as material to exceed summon Super Quantal Mech King Great Magnus, who floats into the 3 mechs when sent to grave, and gains effects based on how many materials it has, with 2 or more letting it attach to quick effect spin a card back into deck, 4 or more making it unaffected by card effects, and 6 or more blocking the opponent from adding cards from deck to hand by card effect. Magnus was without question what you were building towards, being effectively a tower if you could get it to 4 materials, which was fairly reliable if you hit that stage thanks to the field spell most likely summoning the last material right before, meaning you'd have at least 4 materials with that exceed still having its pilot. Super Quant would be a rogue level strategy almost immediately on release, but unfortunately suffered in the meta primarily thanks to the kaijus already being in most players' main or side decks. They would see play, however, as an engine for some decks, as Blue Layer was a level 3 Psychic, making it accessible with Emergency Teleport, being yet another rank 3 enabler that could also search for Red Layer, but they'd find a more interesting home soon enough. Aside from this, Grand Pulse would also find general play as a rank 3 spell trap removal piece, seeing play in Burning Abyss and any other rank 3 deck for that utility. YCS Prague would follow 2 weeks later, and very notably was the first YCS under the new adjusted list, seeing a widespread of decks in the meta following the death of Pepe. Draco Pals would be the standout of the event, adapting Pepe into a more generalized pendulum pile, with the Draco Slayer pieces at the center of it all. Kovacic would take the event with Draco Pals, playing a list similar to Dark Pepe lists we'd seen before, but with the hits cutting the entire performance side of the deck, focused more into the dark package of Armageddon Knight, Zephyros, and Shadal Dragon. Cosmo would make it to second place here thanks to the slow transition of the deck into Tin Can Turbo, adding in more copies of Call the Haunted and Oasis to take advantage of the grave setup provided by the level 1 pilot, still readily abusing Emergency Teleport for the strategy. Monarch would see a little more experimentation to their builds, with the top 4 version playing copies of Super Quantum Red Layer as a special summonable body that could also double up as a tribute summonable monster to trigger your Monarch spell traps like Domain and Return. Phantom Knights would take a top 32 spot on their debut outing, utilizing Blue Layer and Ghost Ogre with Emergency Teleport as rank 3 enablers as well as Protection with Ghost Ogre, as well as the now staple rank 3 enablers of Terror Top and Takam Tom Borg. Berlantian would take a top spot here, marking its comeback into the meta, with Neptibus making the strategy viable to play once again following the culling of the tier 0 mega threat that was keeping them out, marking itself as a viable rogue option in the newly forming metagame. Lastly, and probably most doom and gloom on the format, Chicken Game FTK cracked into the top 16, utilizing various amounts of draw spells ranging from the Chicken Game line to Monarchs utilizing Aether and Erebus to fuel draw spells like Cards from the Sky and Trade-In, to Toon Table of Contents thinning the deck with Blue Eyes Toon Dragon to facilitate the older Library Magical Explosion FTK, which while not meta-defining, it was still an annoyance to deal with an active and consistent FTK in the format fringes. Following 4 days after Prague, the Zexal manga Volume 8 would release, bringing an extremely powerful new promo to the fold. Number S39 Utopia the Lightning is a light-locked 3-material rank 5 that can also be overlaid onto any rank 4 Utopia monster, stuns responses from the opponent while attacking, and can detach 2 materials while it has Utopia underneath to boost itself to 5,000 for that battle, being an out to almost every single monster in the format that can be destroyed in battle, becoming almost instantly a staple of the rank 4 boss pool. YCS Vegas would be 2 weeks later, and while the spread would mostly hold true to the result of Prague previously, a couple of new variants to popular decks would appear here for the first time that would completely reshape the meta over the coming months. The first would be a variant of Monarchs ending in top 32 that, notably, was not playing Domain. Because of this, and the only card in the strategy requiring an empty extra deck being Domain, the extra deck in turn was filled to the brim with options for the strategy to play around with, most notably in rank 5 lines. The Prime Monarch, when revived from the grave, is treated as a level 5 normal light fairy, which in turn means that with 2, you can access one of the most desired rank 5s in the pool, Pleiades, in addition to other various threats, which also repopularized the Super Quants as engine pieces for Monarchs, with Blue Layer and E-Telly providing searches for Red Layer and providing tribute fodder, while Red Layer now pulls double duty from its previous role as well as rank 5 access with Prime Monarch. This variant, known as Extra Deck Monarch, would evolve multiple times over the coming months, and would cement itself as a cornerstone strategy throughout the remainder of the year through various tool additions. The other innovation would be in the topping Burning Abyss deck, as not only were they using the full suite of BA monsters like usual, in addition to the new Fiendish Rhino Warrior from Bosch, but they were also using a small package of Phantom Knights from Wing Raiders. As it turns out, Phantom Knight meshed incredibly well with the Burning Abyss monsters, as they provided rank 3 access to Dante as well as utility from the grave to access tools like Fogblade, which were insanely good for Burning Abyss. This variant, known as Phantom Knight Burning Abyss, or as it would be colloquially referred to as, would rise substantially in popularity following this performance and would only grow more powerful with a certain import in the next set release. Adam Belaradsky would take the event on Draco Pals, utilizing Guiding Ariadne with Solemn Scolding added to the counter trap line, alongside Archphoenix-centric pulling double duty as both a removal for the opponent's pieces, as well as a way to trigger Ariadne. This would lead into the year's Gold Series a week later, and this was geared up to be one of the biggest Gold Series releases in years thanks to a major set of reprints as well as a certain import that would change the meta forever. Premium Gold Infinite Gold. Release date March 18th, 2016. Set type Import Reprint. Major strategies Cosmo, Burning Abyss. Impact, price ceiling lowered, and a meta threat emboldened. Infinite Gold was the third of the Premium Gold line in the 8th Gold Series overall, once again aimed at bringing a couple of OCG imports in addition to reprints that may or may not actually be relevant to the meta when they're received. This time, however, Konami pulled no punches, as not only there were reprints that were actually relevant, reprinting the entire Cosmo Core, Max C, Burning Abyss Core, and various Draco Pals tools, but its imports would be some of the most impactful ones we've seen in years. Most were on the generically useful side this time, with Stardust Charge Warrior being a level 6 generic Synchro that draws 1 on Synchro Summon, Phantom Knights of Shade Brigandine being a trap activatable the turn it's set and summons itself as a level 4, and number 38 Hope Harbinger Dragon Titanic Galaxy being a rank 8 with a spell negate, battle redirection for your other monsters, and a permanent attack buff anytime an Exceed you control dies. But as good as these generic pieces were, they were not what was most focused on. Beatrice, Lady of the Eternal, was a rank 6 that could also be summoned over a Dante monster by discarding a Burning Abyss. Unable to use her effect the turn she summoned this way, able to detach one to quick effect send any card from deck to grave. Burning Abyss would be the first time a TCG exclusive archetype was actually good, and because of that, when the OCG imported it to the game in mid to late 2015, in order to ensure the archetype wasn't outpaced by other archetypes already in the game, they would receive a single new piece of support, being Beatrice. This would start a trend in the OCG of getting 1 to 2 new cards for previously TCG exclusive archetypes to help boost their playability on occasion when importing, which ended up making Burning Abyss a tier 1 threat in the OCG almost immediately on release. As for the TCG, Burning Abyss had never really left the meta since its inception, and with the recent results at Vegas had actually undergone a resurgence in PK Fire, so Beatrice was undoubtedly poised to make an impact, giving the strategy effectively a Lavalval chain but better. YCS San Jose would be the same weekend, and though it appeared not much had changed here, a couple of small impacts from Infinite Gold would be felt, such as the rise in popularity of Cosmo as a more budget-friendly option with the full reprinting of the archetype.
Playing Cosmo.
You idiots!
Playing Cosmo.
And the inclusion of Hope Harbinger into Draco Pals thanks to their easy access to level 8s into Draco Slayer bosses, which would be seen in first place Alejandro Garcia's Draco Pal list. YCS Houston would be 3 weeks later, and this particular YCS would be a tipping point of sorts for the TCG at this point. By now, all of you should be aware of the Hand Trap Max C, released back in 2011, and how it's consistently seen side deck play in any format with a deck that special summoned heavily for its main game plan, but also had many formats at this point where it wasn't the greatest option due to decks being popular in the format that would get you maybe 1 or 2 draws tops. This particular event would mark the beginnings of what would be Max C's reign over the TCG, as this format was filled to the brim with decks that all loved to special summon multiple times a turn to build their end boards, which would become the norm for the game as a whole moving into later 2016 and especially into 2017, which in turn caused Max C to move from its home in the sideboard into the main deck at 3 copies in almost every single top 32 list here, which would stay for the remainder of its time in the TCG. As for the meta itself, while decently diverse in its spread, there were easily 4 candidates for top deck of the format, being that of Draco Pals, PK Fire, Cosmo, and Monarchs, with each having multiple viable variants to play. PK Fire was without question the talk of the event, peaking at top 4 here. With the addition of Beatrice to the deck, the goal was now unquestionably to reach her as fast as possible, which in turn meant that additional rank 3 engines were added to the deck in order to reach Dante reliably to access Beatrice, specifically in that of Speedroid, Terrortop, and Takum Tomborg, who not only accessed Dante for Beatrice, but also didn't take the normal summon, allowing for the summon of a tool like Tour Guide or the Phantom Knights after. There would also be an odd variant to see top 32 here of BA, known as Norlaris BA, which aimed at supplying Skyscourge Norlaris with Beatrice as the fairy required, allowing BA to access a board and hand nuke without much in terms of deck concessions. Infernoid would once again see top 32, still using Deviati as the end boss, notably able to play through the popular Solemn Strike effectively as its summon effect can still be used from the grave. Merlantian would see another top 32, now also utilizing the Kaijus more effectively with the Interrupted Kaiju Slumber package. Andre Torres would take the event on Draco Pals, utilizing both the Ariadne package as well as the new inclusion of number 38 to the extra deck lineup, able to match up well into the mirror with those options. With that, a new ban list would take effect on April 11th, 2 days after Houston, and with it we'd see the finalization of the previous adjusted list changes in addition to a number of new hits. Newly banned were Chicken Game, putting an end to the popular FTK deck, and Wavering Eyes, as the spell was not countering pendulums as was hoped, but rather was just making them stronger while also being a silver bullet in the mirror match. Newly limited were Ignister Prominence, Wisdom Eye, and Draco Face Off, all as hits to Draco Pals, Reasoning as a hit to Cosmo and Infernoid, Norden and Upstart as hits to the popular staples, and Thousand Eyes Restrict returning from the banned section. Newly semi-limited were Emergency Teleport as a hit to Cosmo and the Super Quant engine for Monarch, and Debris and Allure returning from 1. Lastly, unlimited were Demok with an Errata, Tragodia, Advanced Ritual Art, and Crush Card Virus, all being seen as acceptable in the current environment. This list took aim at the continued success of Draco Pals far more than any other strategy in the meta, and for good reason. While the meta had diversified quite substantially, Draco Pals was still the top deck, taking just over 40% of tops since the adjusted list, so while a hit was necessary, it may have been too much considering the meta adjustments that were still being felt from the release of Beatrice. and if one card could change a deck's meta viability once, it was sure to be able to do it a second time, as the next side set released the same week was bound to shift something in the meta, though not in a way most players would appreciate. Millennium Pack. Release date, April 15th, 2016. Set type, import set. Major strategies, cards from the original anime. Impact, how far can you go for a draw 3? Millennium Pack would be yet another side set aimed at printing niche cards from the original anime, similar to Dragons of Legend before it, and for the most part would be forgotten in the long term as just another side set in the sea of new products from the Arc 5 era. However, there were two specific cards that appeared on this particular set that would catch the eye of the casual observer, and they would both provide a significant benefit to the user for a heavy cost. The first of these was Left Arm Offering, allowing you to, if you have 2 or more cards in hand and are fine with a lock from setting cards that turn, banish your entire hand to search for any spell from your deck. While this was insane on paper, the practicality of it would be immediately suspect, as locking you from setting first meant you couldn't save any part of the hand, as it all had to go for the search, which would see some experimentation but for the time being was too heavy a cost for the insanely powerful upside. On the other hand, Card of Demise could draw until you had 3 cards in hand, blocks the opponent from taking more damage that turn, locks you from special summoning for the entire turn, and discards the entire hand in the end phase. This card, though, didn't block you from setting, which opened an entire can of worms onto the format known as Demise decks. Decks that specialize in setting a ton of back row, getting up to a draw 3 off, and then setting more, standardly paired with a strategy that could take advantage of the back row to either play a stun game more often than not, like in the case of Demise Clifford, or to fuel massive recursion plays, such as the case of Demise Cosmo. Both of these strategies would be seen as immediately meta viable thanks to the spell, though it would take a little to truly catch on as Clifford was decently out of the meta at this point, and Cosmo had a whole different thing going on with Tin Can Turbo, though soon would adapt. YCS Santiago would be 2 weeks later, and with the recent ban list changes, PK Fire would rise rapidly into its new dominant top spot, taking first place piloted by Nicolas Godoy, who didn't make his list public. All in all though, this event showed us that despite the drop in performance from Draco Pals, the remainder of the meta sat unchanged, with most waiting to see if the next core set could kick up some kind of shift in the metagame as a whole. Shining Victories. Release date, May 6th, 2016. Set type, core set. Major strategies, Blue Eyes, Amorphage, Lunalite. Impact, a custom-built meta breaker. Shining Victories would be the second core set of the year, and it was pretty much billed as the Blue Eyes set, so let's just dive into them. Blue Eyes would see a massive overhaul to its support, seeing an entire archetype of sorts spawn around its previous pieces from the old Saga of Blue Eyes structure deck back in the 5Ds era. Dragon Spirit of White was always considered a Blue Eyes card, is treated as a normal monster in hand and grave, banishes a spell trap when summoned, and contribute itself on quick effect to summon the OG Blue Eyes from hand. Sage with Eyes of Blue searches a level 1 light tuner on normal, yes that does include Veiler, and can be discarded to turn an effect monster you control into a Blue Eyes monster from your deck, which conveniently triggers Maiden's Summon effect too since it targets an effect monster. The Whitestone of Ancients, the turn it's sent to grave, summons a Blue Eyes from deck if it's still in grave at the end of the turn, and can banish itself from grave to recur a Blue Eyes monster. Blue Eyes Twin Burst Dragon must be fused with 2 original Blue Eyes or by sending 2 to grave from field, can't be destroyed by battle, can attack twice on monsters, and banishes anything it attacks but doesn't destroy. Blue Eyes Spirit Dragon is a level 9 synchro that takes a tuner and a Blue Eyes, blocks both players from summoning multiple monsters at the same time, can negate a grave effect once per turn, and contribute itself on quick effect to summon a light dragon synchro from extra deck except itself, destroying it in the end phase. This support was honestly really solid. Sage had insane versatility in that it could search for a stone or Veiler depending on the open, or could be discarded to convert a monster into Dragon Spirit from deck, which in turn let you answer back row in a safer manner since Spirit could just tag out. Stone also meshed well with the previous Stone of Legends as an insanely valuable Cards of Consonance target, getting another body at the end phase or recursion for a burned piece, which could both be used on different turns. Spirit Dragon though was the major talking point, as its effect was almost handcrafted for the current meta. Blocking multiple special summons at once was a clear middle finger to Pendulums as a mechanic, and the grave negation effect seemed tailor-made for a matchup like PK Fire, but at this time, Blue Eyes would be nothing more than a rogue option. While all of this sounds good on paper, at the end of the day you're still very heavily reliant on the original vanilla Blue Eyes, which reminder is a level 8 vanilla, a brick in most cases, as well as Maiden, who used to be a decent option to stall or set up with, but now... Most decks might be running engines that require bricks at this stage, but it doesn't mean that they're always chomping at the bit to use them, and without a consistent way to access Spirit Dragon outside of Sage and Prey, the deck wasn't going anywhere for now. Luna Light is a series of beast warriors centered around combat and fusion summons, with each of their fusions ranking up off of each other to get more and more powerful combat effects, but quite notably were clunky and not worth the investment due to being easily dealt with before reaching the battle phase. The only notable points to the support here were Black Sheep, being a searcher for poly that was itself searchable with Tenki, and Tiger, whose revival effect being a soft once per turn meant that it could theoretically provide an insane amount of recursion with cards that bounce it back to hand like Zephyros, but for now was left with no good targets to revive. Amorphage was a series of dragon pendulums that all locked special summons from the extra deck when pendulum summoned, or flip face up for the lower levels, and in general for the higher. Because this lock didn't require a pendulum summon for the higher levels, Sloth here would see some play in decks thanks to it being a one tribute monster that you could search with various pendulum search cards that you could tribute summon at the end of a combo. Performapal, Odd Eyes, Light Phoenix, and Unicorn's effects mostly don't matter outside of niche circumstances where Light Phoenix stays in scale to chump block for you. What matters here is that they are both Performapal and Odd Eyes monsters that fill both a low and high scale requirement, meaning that Sky Iris can find its way back into pendulum lists now that it can search something relevant that isn't named Pendulum Dragon. Cosmo Dark Lady is a level 5 pilot that can pay 1,000 to negate and destroy a monster effect with a standard pilot tag out. While disappointing that Dark Lady was the only relevant new card Cosmo would receive in this wave, Dark Planet looks so cool, but it's just so bad. It did solve a massive issue in the Tin Can Turbo variant of the deck, that being a monster that you can search with Tin Can to immediately summon before Tin Can gets banished by Itali's drawback. Dark Lady giving the Cosmo board a monster negate also provides them more versatility in their revival game plan, as you can negate a monster with Dark Lady without needing to waste a valuable Dark Destroyer pop on them, then potentially tag her into a Dark Destroyer later anyways. Thunder King, the Lightning Strike Kaiju, is now the strongest Kaiju at 3300 attack. That's it. It's just a better card to summon with IKS now. Angel Trumpeter is a level 4 normal tuner, meaning that for decks already experimenting with unexpected die, namely that of pendulums, they could easily tech this in as a one-of for easier access to things like Ignister Prominence, which with a limited luster is appreciated. Lecter Pendulum, the Drake Overlord, destroys both itself and a pendulum at the start of the damage step when battling, giving another solid Drake Overlord target for Draco Face-Off, which would have probably been more relevant had the spell not just been limited. Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries can, if the opponent has more monsters, discard herself to reveal an extra deck monster and banish all copies of it from the opponent's extra deck. The second addition to the Ghost Girl lineup held some interesting applications in the current metagame thanks to the extra deck standardly centralizing pull as of late. Primarily with applications against Burning Abyss specifically, as by cutting off a BA player's access to Dante, you also cut them off of Beatrice. Still, most decks in the meta were not as heavily reliant on one specific card in the extra, so for now she'd be relegated to a side deck pick at best. Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon is a level 8 synchro requiring a tuner and a non-tuner synchro, can negate and destroy a monster using its effect once per turn and gain its attack for the turn, and if it battles a level 5 or higher gains that monster's attack. Talk about an upgrade. Crystal Wing was everything Clear Wing was and more, with the only downside being that it now requires a synchro as material to make, making it much harder to access than desired, but luckily there was already a solution to that in the card pool. Because it was a level 8 Dragon Synchro, Zulkin had found its target, able to cheat out Crystal Wing in decks that could make it, though none had really become known by this point. Digital Bug Corbage would be one of the payoffs to the Digital Bug archetype that debuted here, being a rank 5 that could also rank up over a rank 3 or 4 insect by detaching 2 materials, able to detach one to spin away a defense mode monster, able to reattach a material from grave if a monster changes battle position on field. This, interestingly enough, could rank up over Giga Brilliant, a generic rank 3 that was already seeing the occasional play in Burning Abyss builds, giving the rank 3 powerhouse yet another generic tool. Raid Raptor Ultimate Falcon requires 3 level 10 wing beasts to summon, or more simply, any number of the rank up magic spells being used on a rank 8 Raid Raptor, is unaffected by card effects, can detach to drop all opponents by 1000 attack and locking them from using effects for the turn, and can, if it has a Raid Raptor as material, drop all opponents by 1000 attack or burn the opponent for 1000 if they control no face-up monsters. Rank Up Magic Skip Force lets you rank up a Raid Raptor Exceed 2 ranks and can banish itself and a Raid Raptor engrave to revive a Raid Raptor Exceed. Between Skip Force and Soul Shave Force, Raid Raptor had seen a boon in new good rum spells, and Ultimate Falcon was finally a payoff worth ranking up too, being a towers that burned each turn or dropped the burn to go for the kill. While this wouldn't make Raid Raptor meta, it would solidify the deck as a solid rogue to tier 3 option, not able to rise up further due to the ever-present kaijus. Pre-preparation of Rites can search a ritual spell from deck and a monster listed on that ritual spell from grave or deck. That's right, we buffed old rituals. Take that, Necroz! In reality, a buff to the old way of ritual summoning is honestly a really great design, but it still sat in a space of useless for now. Almost all the relevant rituals in 2016 were either tied to an archetype of generic ritual spells, a la Necroz or Gishki, or were far too slow or weak to justify running in the first place. This would grow in power though as new ritual designs would keep this particular card in mind, specifically in the fact that it doesn't have to mention the monster in the summon effect, it just needs to mention it period. Drowning Mirror Force completes the Elemental Retrains of Mirror Force series by only being activatable when a direct attack is declared, spinning away all attack position monsters. Without question, the best payoff for any of these cards, even beating out the shockingly good Quaking Mirror Force, but with the downside of needing the opponent to attack directly, who is going to play something like this? Yeah, so Demise decks already want to draw almost entirely back row and very little to no monsters, so Drowning would fit perfectly into their lineups, which we'd see soon enough. Lastly, Fire King Island could pop a monster on field or in hand to search a Fire King monster or could summon a Fire Winged Beast from hand once per turn, nuking your monsters if sent to grave or banished. While a solid card for Fire Kings, giving the deck the ability to search for its key pieces while triggering their pop effects, the strategy still wasn't going anywhere with its current game plan. However, Island popping cards in the hand was such a unique effect to give to an easily accessible field spell that it got the wheels turning. What all cards can trigger when destroyed by a card effect while in hand? That's right, you bet. Cosmo. Every single ship's floating effect did not require it to be on field first, meaning you could pop a ship in hand to float into something like Tin Can, which in turn started your entire play line. But it couldn't be that powerful, could it? YCS Providence would be held 3 weeks after Shining Victories release, and clearly a shift had happened, but in a very strange way overall. Cosmo had taken 13 of the top 32, with at least 4 of those being a new variant in Fire King Cosmo. Island had clearly made an impact on the strategy, seeing a single copy played to where it could be searched by terraforming, and it was a full access to your Cosmo engine without the need to commit your normal summon or play E-Telly. In addition, it was fairly simple to get the island off the board so it wouldn't be a detriment later, as by popping a ship with it to float into Slip Rider, you could pop the island with it, which in turn would pop the slip to then float into a pilot to start your lines without the island potentially nuking the board later. Demise Cosmo would also see its first real success here, playing a slimmed down pilot and ship spread to make room for more revival traps, floodgates, responses, and of course Card of Demise, which could net massive draws for the deck given the right opening. Speaking of Demise, Cliffort would find a top spot here sporting Demise as well, also loading up on plenty of Cliffort tailored floodgates like Recolate and Rivalry of Warlords in addition to the new Drowning Mirror Force. Pendulum strategies would see a wide variety of tops here, ranging from your more standard Draco Pals variant to a couple of Magispector variants and even a Pendulum Magician variant. The Draco Pals and Magician variants specifically though were now sporting Sky Iris not only as a way to protect the scales, but also to access the new odd-eye scales of Light Phoenix and Unicorn, rounding out their scale lines and giving yet another way to pop a pen scale. Extra deck Monarchs had overtaken their domain brethren to rule the slice of the pie chart, but a very specific development here would shift the deck structure even more into the insane pile it was becoming. Brilliant Fusion, a card we've mentioned a couple times at this point but not really had a reason to focus on in the metagame, now had a true home and purpose. Because the engine sent a light for part of Seraphonite's requirement, you could send a Dea for the summon, which in turn would cycle back a Monarch spell trap that's banished, but that's easily the more minor of the 3 benefits. Seraphonite providing an extra normal summon was also insanely powerful for the strategy, giving access to multiple Monarch bodies on the first turn, which also meant that Erebus could now reliably hand rip twice on the first turn, which was also a great benefit. The arguably strongest part though was one that was pretty basic but effective. Seraphonite is a level 5. Because of this and Prime Monarch already abusing the rank 5 pool, Seraphonite could easily be turned into half of Pleiades once the extra normal was used, and as such the engine would become far more popular for Monarchs as the WCQ season spun up. Tamid Zaman would take the event on PK Fire, playing a mostly standard build to what we've come to expect from this strategy, notably trimming the Ragged Gloves count down to 1 as it was easily the worst of the 3 Phantom Knight monsters in the main. The WCQ season would begin with Central America 2 weeks later, and for the the most part, the meta had once again solidified around Monarch, Cosmo, Pendulum, and PK Fire, with multiple variants of each populating their section of the chart, most of which were known at this stage, but a new face would appear in some Monarch lists. Quick Draw Synchron had been experimented with for Monarch decks since the Extra Deck Monarch pivot, but overall never really had a reason to be played over something like Red Layer until now. You see, its restriction on what can be synchro summoned with it only applies to things that are properly synchro summoned, meaning that by being an easily summonable level 5 tuner, it and any of the many other level 5 spam options in the deck could make Ultimaya Zulkin, which in turn could access the new powerhouse that was Crystal Wing. This would add yet another option to the ever-growing pool of options for Extra Deck Monarch, with another interesting development also happening here on the Brilliant Fusion Engine side. Rather than playing the Garnet to access a Dia to cycle back a spell trap, as that line wasn't always live when playing the Brilliant out the gate like many wanted to do, Monarch would start opting for Gem Knight Lazuli and a normal monster of choice, in this case Jax Knight, to cycle back to hand for a level 5 tribute summonable body that could trigger return. This would evolve over the next few weeks to instead search Dark Witch specifically because she's a level 5 light fairy that you can summon under Gozen or Rivalry with Seraphonite already on the board. Brandon Gonzalez would take the event on Extra Deck Monarchs, notably also playing Lazuli as the Brilliant Fusion target, though wasn't playing a normal with it. Oceania would be held the same weekend, and although we have a top 16 breakdown for this event, we don't have much else, as at this point in time Oceania was consistently the one event that saw absolutely minimal coverage. Matthew Caserio would win the event with Extra Deck Monarch, though we do not have a list for this. Interestingly enough, though it was normally frowned upon to hold a YCS during WCQ season, YCS Origins would be held just a week after Oceanics, and a couple of new additions to the variant piles would be seen here for the first time. Magispector would be the newest deck to hop on the Demise train, sacrificing its Pendulum summon for the turn to draw more of the Magispector back row, which is actually decently potent thanks to Tempest and Tornado providing really solid interruption points, on top of being able to get Magispectors out of the hand for Demise by setting them as pen scales, similar to Demise Cliffort. The other new variant was Burning Abyss Monarch, taking the Extra Deck Monarch game plan another step further by now running an entire Burning Abyss core within the Monarch lineup, to provide both tribute fodder in addition to Beatrice access, which set up your Monarch spell traps quite effectively. Jacob Finney would take the event on PK Fire, being a fairly standard outing for the deck at this stage. The South American WCQ would be held the same weekend, and aside from a strong showing from PK Fire compared to its competition, nothing too special would be at this event. Joaquin Petroni would take the event on Magispector Draco Pals, which at this stage was becoming almost the default variant of Draco Pals thanks to its access to Kirin, which boosted the potency of their inboard significantly. Interestingly, there would be almost a 1-month gap between the remaining WCQs, in which time the newest Shonen Jump promo would be mailed out, being number S0 Utopic Zexal, able to be overlaid onto a Utopia monster by discarding a rank up magic, can't have its summon negated, locks responding to its summon, gains 1000 attack and defense for each material, and can detach on the opponent's turn to lock them from activating cards or effects that turn. This card was a house! Being able to lock the opponent effectively out of their deck on their turn was an insanely powerful effect, but it suffered in its summon requirement. At this stage, there was no reliable way to search for rank up magics, meaning that the only deck that could reliably make it was one that was already playing rank ups in the first place. Raid Raptor would adopt this boss into their lineup quite easily thanks to already being chock full of level 4s to access Utopia with, though this wouldn't improve the deck's meta placement at all for now. While we do need to still talk about 2 more WCQs and a set release, I'm going to pause here to specifically talk about a historic moment in the Yu-Gi-Oh community's history here that needs to be at the very least mentioned. Many simulators for online play have risen and fallen in the history of the game, as they either get outpaced by advancing technology, the dev teams leave them to rot, or, in very rare circumstances, a company orders them to shut down. Dueling Network had been around since 2011, and up until this point in history had been the go-to platform for testing and deck theorizing, but had over the last year undergone some legal issues stemming around the usage of the official card art for the game from the company Nihon Ad Systems, or NAS for short, who was the production company in charge of the Yu-Gi-Oh animes. Though they had tried to comply by removing all art of the game from the site, a cease and desist motion was filed, and on July 6, 2016, Dueling Network as it was known was fully taken offline. This would send a shockwave through the community, as while some other simulators existed for testing, none were as widely used and accepted as Dueling Network. And while a successor would launch about 6 months later, being Dueling Book, which is still used to this day, it would still be a moment that hit almost everyone in the community. community. With all of that out of the way, there's also a set release just 2 days after the DN takedown, and this would be the one chance of shaking things up in the meta before the remaining 2 WCQs could take place. Rise of the True Dragons. Release date, July 8th, 2016. Set type, Structure Deck. Major strategies, Dragon. Impact, a single new spell for Blue Eyes. Rise of the True Dragons would be the second of the Structure Deck R series in the OCG, modernizing the Felgrand structure, and man did it fail hard. The main goal of the deck is to use their level 4 warriors to equip one of their bosses from deck to themselves, then tribute themselves off to revive them, as the target of their revival effect isn't chosen until after you tribute. This is done to facilitate Arcbrave Dragon, who banishes all of an opponent's back row on summon from grave and can revive a level 7 or 8 dragon the turn after it's put in grave, and Divine Dragon Lord Felgrand, who banishes a monster on summon from grave and revives a level 7 or 8 dragon on destroying something in battle. While interesting, the issue stood in that the warriors can't activate their effects until you have at least one dragon in grave, which the deck did nothing to really circumvent outside of reprinting Foolish Burial, which was limited. However, a new spell that would be interesting here was Return of the Dragon Lords, being a monster reborn for level 7 and 8 dragons and can be banished from grave to prevent a dragon's destruction. This would be recognized as a perfect addition to Blue Eyes specifically, as the revival conditions matched up perfectly with Blue Eyes' main deck pieces and gave the dragons great protection to use after, though Blue Eyes still wasn't meta viable with this. The NAWCQ would be the same weekend, and once again, the meta was fairly set in stone at this point, with the main 4 continuing to shift around their ratios, with PK Fire and Monarch both taking 21 of the top 64 each. Psyframe would squeak into top 64 just barely here thanks in large part to Drowning Mirror Force, as the deck already liked to pass on an empty monster row to keep their Psyframes live as much as possible, so having a back row that heavily benefits from this was greatly appreciated. Eric Christensen would take the event on Domain Monarch, which came as a shock to most as the Domain variant was widely regarded as the weakest of the Monarch variants at this stage, seemingly pulling the dream run for the deck. The EU WCQ would be the next weekend, being the last of the WCQs for the year, and we'd see a new variant of Cosmo land in the top 64 here with Speedroid Cosmo, aiming at utilizing the Terratop engine to access various rank 3s either as extension in the case of Leviair, or to clear out threats prior to committing to the Cosmo line such as with Grand Pulse or Break Sword. Samir Bakar would take the event on Magispector Draco Pals, notably playing QB and a small Magispector trap line to add additional disruption to the deck's end board. This would mark the official end of the WCQ season, with Worlds just around the corner. However, with Worlds coming up, the qualifying players would be looking over the combined card pool and ban list to see what just might be the best option. But the best option might have been just a little further ahead, as it seems that Konami was rushing a certain product out way sooner than we in the TCG should have received it, to stack Worlds in the favor of one specific deck. Dark Side of Dimensions Movie Pack. Release date, July 22nd, 2016. Set type, Import Set. Major strategies, Blue Eyes, Gadget, Cubic. Impact, skewing the balance of worlds. The DSoD movie pack is interesting to talk about in retrospect because of the timing of it all. In the OCG, it was released alongside the movie of the same name, bringing the cards from the movie to the OCG on the same day as the movie's release. For other countries though, DSoD wasn't set to be released until 2017, so why debut the tie-in movie set so early in the TCG? Well, the prevailing theory is that Konami rushed this set out because of a certain set of support that would affect the deck's performance at Worlds. Blue Eyes would receive the other side of its new major support wave here just in time. Neo Ultimate is a retrain of the original Ultimate, taking the same materials, able to send a Blue Eyes fusion from extra to grave after it attacks while it's your only monster to attack again, able to use this effect twice in a turn, and can banish itself from grave to negate and destroy anything that targets a Blue Eyes. Chaos Max is a level 8 ritual that can't be targeted and deals double piercing damage. Lastly, Alternative White Dragon must first be summoned by revealing an original Blue Eyes in hand, becomes the original Blue Eyes on field and in grave, and can pop a monster once per turn in exchange for its attack. This changed everything for Blue Eyes, as you now had a reliable monster to summon alongside your level 1 tuners to access Spirit Dragon on the first turn. This also pulled Melody of Awakening Dragon out of the bulk pile at last because it searched for Alternative and the OG Blue Eyes, giving you the ability to summon it out immediately. On the more niche side of things, Chaos Max was also a boss worth considering, as it could be summoned with advanced ritual art by dumping an OG Blue Eyes from deck, giving an option to absolutely obliterate more defensive decks. It's fair to say that this support was the reason the pack was rushed out so fast, making the strategy completely legal for Worlds, which we'd see soon enough. The rest of the pack was dedicated to other strategies from DSoD, specifically that of Cubic, a stall-focused strategy focused around Vijam, who can't be destroyed in battle and locks up monsters at battles, and the Magician Girls, a series of spellcasters that loop with one another to fill up the board. The only other notable cards here would be that of Gold and Silver Gadget, who summoned a level 4 machine from hand on summon and float into any other gadget on destruction, which would see some experimentation for now, but not widespread success until much later in the year. This wouldn't be the only new set before Worlds though, as the next core set would also debut beforehand, but whether it would be impactful to the world scene would have to be seen. The Dark Illusion. Release date August 5th, 2016. Set type Core Set. Major strategies Dark Magician, Metal Foes, Paleozoic. Impact laying the groundwork for future metas. The Dark Illusion was the third core set of 2016, and while it wouldn't be as explosive as Bosch or the fourth core set of the year, Teedle would lay the groundwork for multiple meta archetypes that would take hold later in the year and beyond. Following the archetype spawned around Blue Eyes, Dark Magician would receive a wave of legacy support centered around the titular card. Magician of Dark Illusion becomes Dark Magician on field, can summon itself on the opponent's turn when you use a spell trap effect, and can summon a Dark Magician from grave when you use a spell trap effect once while on field. Magician's Robe during the opponent's turn can discard a spell trap to summon Dark Magician from deck, and can summon itself from grave on the opponent's turn when you use a spell trap effect. Magician's Rod searches a spell trap that mentions Dark Magician on normal, and can recur itself on the opponent's turn when you use a spell trap effect by tributing a monster. Ebon High Magician is a spellcaster locked rank 7 that can use quick play spells and traps from hand on the opponent's turn by detaching material for each, and floats into a dark spellcaster in deck on removal, then pops a card on field. Their spell traps all revolve around the original Dark Magician, with Illusion Magic able to tribute a spellcaster to search up to 2 Dark Magicians from deck or grave, Dark Magic Expand gaining more effects for each Dark Magician or girl on field or in grave, with 1+ boosting a Dark Spellcaster by 1000, 2+ locking the opponent from chaining to spell trap effects and preventing them from destruction, and 3+ making Dark Spellcasters you control immune to card effects, and Magician Navigation, summoning a Dark Magician from hand and a level 7 or lower Dark Spellcaster from deck, able to banish from grave to negate the effects of a face-up spell trap while you control Dark Magician. Lastly, Dark Magical Circle looks at the top 3 of the deck on activation, adding a Dark Magician or spell trap that mentions it to hand from those, and places the others back in any order, and while on field, banishes an opponent's card once per turn when you summon a Dark Magician. The strategy had a clear direction here, with Circle Control easily being the name of the game with its banish effect, but the issue lied in consistent access to Dark Magician reliably. A lot of the deck's plays relied heavily on Circle and Navigation, which in turn meant you consistently needed a Dark Magician in hand to trigger Nav in the first place, which naturally led to bricking galore. This would leave Dark Magician in the position of a rogue deck at best for now, but a note should be made here about the requirement to search cards that listed Dark Magician specifically. This was clearly put in place to make the new support able to search older cards like Thousand Knives and Dark Magic Curtain, but left a very specific casualty in the funniest way possible. The Eye of Timaeus, despite having Dark Magician written on the card, could not be searched with any of the support due to it not listing Dark Magician specifically, as it said a Dark Magician monster. This would be a bit of a logistical mess in the short term, but a funny trivia fact looking back now. Metal Foes was a new series of normal pendulums, all sharing an effect to pop a face-up card once per turn in the pendulum scale to set a Metal Foes spell trap from deck, with Steelin being a level 2 scale 8, Silver to level 3 scale 1, Gold Driver a level 4 scale 1, and Volflame a level 7 scale 8. Their traps were all focused on furthering the popping effects, with Counter able to summon a Metal Foes from deck when a card you control is popped, able to be banished from grave to recur a Metal Foes and face up extra, and Combination able to summon a Metal Foes from grave with a lower level than a fusion summoned Metal Foes on summon, and searches the Metal Foes monster when sent to grave. Their primary game plan involves using the various pops and pendulum summons to facilitate their main spell Metal Foes Fusion, with a standard fusion effect and the ability to put itself from grave on bottom of deck to draw 1. Adamant is a vanilla fusion of a Metal Foes and a 2500 or less attack monster, Crimsonite is a vanilla fusion of a Metal Foes and 2 3000 or less attack monsters, and Orichalc is a fusion of any 2 Metal Foes that gives all Metal Foes double piercing and pops a card when sent to grave. Metal Foes here poised a compelling strategy, being similar to Ignite but with a set of bosses that didn't hamper the deck's long game, though at this stage would be relegated to tier 3 as its bosses weren't the most meta relevant, but would see experimentation as cards that can pop your monsters that want to be popped, such as Cosmo or even Yang Zing, as the pop and set effects were simultaneous, meaning that Yang Zings wouldn't miss timing. With a third block of sets for the era, Once again, the TCG exclusives would change over to 2 new archetypes, with both receiving 4 cards a set now rather than one getting 5 while the other gets 3. The first of these was Subterror, bringing yet another attempt at revolutionizing flip monsters for the modern day with a bunch of high-level behemoths. Each of the behemoths shares an effect to special summon themselves from hand when your last face-up monster on field flips face down. It can flip themselves face down once per turn. Umastrix on flip banishes an opponent's monster, and Stalagmo on flip discards a Subterror monster to draw 2. Nemesis Warrior would be the starter of sorts, able to dump a Subterror from deck, tribute himself and another monster whose level are equal to or more than the sent monster, and summon it either face up or face down, able to summon itself from grave if a behemoth gets flipped face up. Lastly, the Hidden City.
They're crazy! They think their city's hidden! Bro, it's right there! I see it just fine!
Searches a Subterror on activation, can flip a Subterror face up once per turn, and can negate an attack by flipping a set Subterror face up. While this set of cards was interesting for sure, there wasn't a clear direction to take the strategy out the gate like there was with BA or Cosmo, and it was clear that Konami was favoring this archetype at the time by giving them 2 Ultras and a secret rare between these 4. So most would invest immediately into this archetype with the hopes that waves 2, 3, or 4 would get it there, as for now it wasn't even good enough to be Rogue. The other archetype was Spiral, which was clearly centered around Super Agent, who could summon itself from hand if you called the super type of the top card of the opponent's deck correctly. Popping a spell trap is summoned by a Spiral effect. Gear Drone, able to rearrange the top 3 of the opponent's deck on summon, contribute itself on quick effect to boost a Spiral by 500 for each card the opponent controls, and can banish itself and a Spiral card engraved to recur a Super Agent. Quick Fix can search a Spiral Gear on summon and can summon itself from grave for a discard while you control Super Agent, and Gear Big Red can revive a Spiral and blocks it from being destroyed in battle. Spiral was underplayed in its hype on reveal compared to Subterror, but on initial inspection looked to be the better of the 2 archetypes, being a far more generically usable engine of sorts, with Super Agent providing Board Swarm and spell trap removal, and Quick Fix for some reason being a machine type, meaning that it was abusable with machine duplication. While unassuming now, many would pick up a set of these on release thanks to the potential these initial cards held with just a little shaping. In the OCG import slots though, we'd also see 2 archetypes, one of which was a favorite of the community at this stage that we'd been expecting for far too long. Trains were a series of cards not really designated by an archetype, but rather a designation of being level 4 or 10 Earth machines. These had been introduced back in Zexal and popularized slightly by Gustav Zmak's stint as a burn tool for FTK decks, but here they'd get the couple of pieces the strategy had been missing for a while now. Heavy Freight Train Daracrane can summon itself from hand if you summon an Earth machine and can pop a card when detached from an Exceed. Revolving Switchyard is a field spell that summons a level 4 Earth machine from deck when you summon a level 10, then boosts its level up to 10, and can discard a card to search a level 10 Earth machine. Number 81, Super Dreadnought Rail Cannon Super Dora is a rank 10 that can detach on quick effect to make a monster unaffected by card effects that turn. While it seems odd that I'm focusing on these so much, the OCG got these cards back in Secrets of Eternity, and off of that, a deck known as Shadal Trains was heavily popularized and actually did quite well for the time thanks to Shekanaga, who itself is a level 10 Earth machine, and the deck had been popular for online simulators in the TCG as well for some time, but with the hits to Shadal already present and these coming to us too late, it was clear that Trains would be relegated to a rogue strategy at best. The other OCG import strategy, oddly enough being a Korean exclusive import, was Paleozoic, a series of traps that all shared the effect to summon themselves back as level 2 water aquas from the grave and chained to a trap, with all being unaffected by monster effects when you did. Oleanoids pops a spell trap, Hallucigenia halves a monster's attack and defense that turn, Canadia flips an opponent's monster to face down defense, Bakaya discards a Paleozoic to draw 2, and Anomalocaris is a 3 material rank 2 that's unaffected by monster effects, lets you excavate one and add to hand if it's a trap or send to grave otherwise when a trap is sent to grave, and can attach to pop a card on quick effect if it has trap as material. While interesting for sure, Paleozoic didn't do enough on their own right now to be considered for the meta, though many would be keeping an eye on them for the future if the remainder of their support got imported. DD Savant Thomas in the scale can recur a face-up DD Pendulum from extra deck, and on field can pop a DD in scale to summon a level 8 DDD from deck, giving DDs an option to actually access Oblivion King Abyss Ragnarok semi-reliably, giving DD a slight boost into the meta. Blackwing Gofu the Vague Shadow could summon itself from hand while you control no monsters, optionally summoning 2 tokens when it did, and could banish itself in any number of non-tuners to revive a Blackwing Synchro of that level, making it a tuner. I don't believe anyone has ever used that last effect, as the first effect was actually surprisingly useful for various decks. The new Metal Foes clearly could use it with the tokens as fodder for their search pops, and a level 5 tuner could be used to access level 7 and 8 synchros reliably. Monarch wanted it as a better level 5 tuner to play than Quick Draw, immediately being slotted into variants for Zulkin, and even those without it as a Cyber Dragon-like card, and a couple of other decks aimed at summoning multiple copies of Omega and Trishula to hand loop going first. And this will not be the last time we talk about this card, as while it was already solidly useful, within 1 year it would become one of the most ban-worthy cards the game had seen in a long time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. True King Agni Mazud, the Vanisher, would be the first of the new True King archetype, able to summon itself from hand by popping 2 monsters on field or in hand, including a fire, banished a monster when summoned this way, and recurred a non-fire worm if both pops were fire. Though interesting for sure, this card was a bit too early to the party to be useful yet, but let's put a pin in that and we'll circle back to it in 2017. Shiranui Solitaire, contribute a zombie to summon a zombie tuner with 0 defense from deck, and if banished can summon a banished Shiranui monster. This was the only card Shiranui needed to be relevant, and boy was it. By tributing itself, you could summon Unizombie from deck, who in turn put a Spectral Sword from deck into grave to make its level 4. From there, Spectral Sword could banish itself in Solitaire to summon a level 6 Synchro, namely Samurai Saga, then use Solitaire's other effect to resummon the Spectral Sword to Synchro into an 8 and set up the grave for a Shogun Saga the following turn. While this sounds like it's just a great day for zombie lovers all around, of course, there's some degeneracy attached to this. While one would assume they'd summon more in-archetype pieces this way, or maybe even a cool zombie or two, this combo was used to reliably access multiple copies of Omega and Trishula on turn 1 to hand rip the opponent. I mean, they really did make it easy, didn't they? 1 card access to a level 8 Synchro and a level 4 or 5 tuner, what more could you ask for? This would, unfortunately, be a decently popular option in the upcoming metagame, and would be a deck that would have to be accounted for in multiple metagames moving forward. Speaking of, Block Dragon can be special summoned by banishing 3 Earths from hand or grave, blocks all destruction except battle destruction, and if sent to grave searches up to 3 rocks whose total level equals 8. This card on release was a complete flop, as there was not a single rock archetype or deck that was good enough to include this and be meta, though some would try this with Triamids from the same set and with the prior rock stun, but both would come up short, though this card would be seen again. Fairy Tail Snow on summon flips an opponent's monster face down and can be summoned from grave by banishing 7 cards from hand, field, or grave. Oh, I get it, like the 7 dwarves. Snow is a weird card to talk about in a vacuum, as it was recognized as good out the gate, being constantly recurable by banishing used cards, but for the time being was relegated to an option for decks that specialized in milling like Lightsworn. And that is something we will have to discuss later, as it's a whole nother can of worms. Coral Dragon is a level 6 Synchro Tuner that can discard a card to pop a card, and when sent to grave draws a card. Simple, effective, and gave decks with easy level 6 Synchro access to Zulkin. Yeah, because of Stardust Charge Warrior, a common practice moving forward for decks that can make 2 level 6 Synchros is to make these 2 to access Zulkin and Crystal Wing thanks to the draws they provide, which would prove to be quite useful over time. Cosmic Cyclone, for the cost of 1,000 life points, can banish a spell trap, being clearly intended as yet another alternative to MST that handled more cases in a far stronger way, which would see serious play following release. Card of the Soul could search any monster whose total attack and defense equaled your current life points. While this card was incredibly niche, some experimentation would be seen with it for searching monsters with a total of 8,000 thanks to your starting life total being that much, primarily in use with Obelisk the Tormentor and Cosmo Dark Planet. Floodgate Trap Hole could flip any summoned monster face down permanently, which would see serious play as a way to mass lock a bunch of Pendulum summoned monsters all at once as a Rafflesia target. Lastly, and without question the most hotly debated card of the time, Pot of Desires could banish the top 10 cards of your deck face down to draw 2. This would be a card that caused massive divide in the player base immediately on whether or not it was worth playing, debating whether this was a +1 or a -9, and truthfully, this wouldn't have happened if the card wasn't a secret rare. The common consensus was that Desires in a deck that's almost exclusively built of 3-ofs with no critical garnets was without question an insanely great option, while decks that played a lot of 1-ofs or played heavier garnet counts for their engines would maybe pass on the card, but there was no questioning its impact. The Dark Illusion was a far more impactful set than one might have expected on the 10, but it wasn't the only pack shaking up the meta just before Worlds, as there was another OCG import set just 2 weeks later, and based on how last year's iteration went, this one had a lot of slack to pick up.
「君の声が聞こえる」
Dragons of Legend Unleashed. Release date, August 19th, 2016. Set type, import set. Major strategies, Cyber Angel, Numeron, Flower Guardian. Impact, a tech for ritual decks. Dragons of Legend Unleashed was the third crack at the Dragons of Legend import sets, with the first being meta-warpingly good and the second being one of the worst sets of all time. This would land somewhere on the worst end of the spectrum, but unlike 2, actually had a couple of useful cards. Cyber Angel was a series of ritual fairies, with effects ranging from combat bonuses to full piece recursion. Of the initial wave, the one primarily focused on by most was Ben 10, able to search for any light fairy when tributed. Because of this interaction, there was a laundry list of cards that Ben 10 could search in the right deck, from play starters like Stick and Chair, to floodgates like Christia and Vanity's Ruler, to even more copies of itself as ritual fodder, which put it on a lot of people's lists as a ritual toolbox enabler. Number 100 Numeron Dragon can be made with any 2 same name number exceeds, and can detach to boost itself by the total ranks of exceeds on the field times 1000, making it a prime OTK enabler for decks with heavy exceed summons, but at the time did not have enough ranks to enable it effectively. Galaxy Eye's Cypher Dragon can detach to steal an opponent's monster, make its attack 3000, and change its name to Galaxy Eye Cypher Dragon for the turn. This would be a fairly massive boon for the Galaxy Eye's Exceed pool at the time, providing a reliable rank 8 that can be used to overlay onto for any number of Exceed rank ups, while still actually doing something useful on its own. The Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship 2016 would be held the same weekend, and though Blue Eyes was handed the golden ticket for the event, it would actually see some serious competition for top 8. PK Fire would squeeze in a single top 8 spot, primarily suffering here due to the limited status of Dante in the OCG, which coupled with the various hits to the main deck BAs already present, would leave the deck to rely more heavily on its other rank 3 tools, specifically in Break Sword. Magispector would climb all the way to top 4, utilizing Sky Iris for completing scales and giving access to high enough scales to keep Kieran on the board. Kieran here would be a major player, as its effect being a repeatable bounce between turns gave Magispector a serious amount of long game play, even once the spell trap lines were used up. Though it had competition in the top 8, the finals would be a mirror match between Blue Eyes, with very similar builds being found between both players. With the addition of Alternative to the deck, a player could now reliably access Spirit Dragon going first, which in turn locked out its competition and could even dodge removal with its effect to tag into a Light Dragon, which gave the option of Azure Eyes, the intended target of this effect, as its destruction immunity would overwrite the downside of Spirit, as well as alternative targets in Black Rose, Moonlight Dragon, and Stardust Spark. Hayame Shinsuke of Japan would take this year's Worlds title with Blue Eyes, not only marking himself as the first, and so far only player to win Worlds twice, but in back-to-back years no less. With no time to recover, YCS Rimini would take place a week later, and shockingly, Blue Eyes would be nowhere to be seen in the top 32. Without the combined ban list of the TCG and OCG, Blue Eyes could not compete with its contemporaries enough to crack in, needing a ban list to do so in the future. Probably the biggest point of note here would be the top spot of Brilliant Lightsworn, which went completely undefeated in Swiss rounds only to fall out in top 32. The new pieces the deck gained from Dark Illusion were actually incredibly significant, being Fairy Tale Snow, which could utilize your milled engraved cards incredibly well for access to Minerva by being half of a rank 4, meaning you could detach and mill more, gaining even more fodder for another run. This would actually be the tipping point for Minerva, as moving forward from here, rank 4 focused decks that utilized milling would become more and more popular, arguably a top tier contender in the meta, but would be held back entirely by the price point of Minerva, because as of this event, she was no longer the YCS prize card in rotation, meaning that her quantities were extremely limited now, even more than they had been before. Alberto Conti would take the event on Fire King Cosmo, utilizing more niche picks like Delta Shuttle, Landwalker, and even 3 Soar Troopers, a practice not common amongst Cosmo players of the era. He would also be the first recipient of the new YCS prize card number 39 Utopia Kaiser, which would not be relevant in the meta.
Thank you!
YCS Toronto would be the same weekend, and similarly would hold the same meta we've come to expect with a singular standout, being the usage of Despair Uranus in a single topping Monarch list, which we unfortunately do not have a deck list for, but is listed as such in Konami's coverage, able to access the Monarch continuous spell traps, depending on the opponent's choice. Bodon Temnyk would take the event on PK Fire, a common sight of the format at this stage. The ban list would be updated 2 days later on August 29th, and unsurprisingly would bring down a culling wave onto the meta for the past 6 months. Newly banned were Performapal Monkey Board, the one-card scale option of Pendulum Strategies, and Kaiser Coliseum, an annoyance to play into on all fronts. Newly limited were Beatrice and Seer as hits to PK Fire, Aether, Pantheism, and Stormforth as hits to Monarch, Dark Destroyer and E-Telly as hits to Cosmo, and Kieran and Pendulum Call as hits to Pendulum. Newly semi-limited were Max C, sparking a massive debate in the community on whether the Blowout hand trap even had a place at 1 or 2, and Ryo and Wind-Up Magician, returning from 1. Lastly, unlimited were Thousand Eyes Restrict, Allure of Darkness, and Gold Sarcophagus, with 2 of these still being solid options for some decks in the meta. With the blanket hits across the board to all 4 meta strategies, PK Fire, Monarch, Cosmo, and Pendulums would all need to restructure or die to remain. What was particularly funny about this list was the seemingly lax hits doled out to specifically PK Fire, as while Beatrice to 1 was certainly a hit and losing another Seer would hurt, many expected the hit to be given to Dante, as it was in the OCG. This re-sparked the Dante is banlist immune discussion, which would also lead to easily one of the greatest memes in the game's history being born, and if you haven't seen this before, I would heavily recommend pausing here and going to watch it, as it is a wonderful piece of Yu-Gi-Oh history. The year's Megaton would also follow this band list, notably reprinting the archetypes of DDD, Fluffle, Gem Knights, Ignites, Kaiju, Magispector, Performage, and Performapal, but also bringing us 2 specific promos of note. DDD Flame King Genghis and Gus King Alexander would be imported here, being a fusion of 2 DDs and a level 7 synchro requiring a DD tuner respectively, with both sharing an effect to revive a DD when a DD is summoned, with Flame King able to revive a DD on special summon, and Alexander being able to revive a level 4 or lower on normal or special, both being critical pieces of the DD deck's combo lines, but still not quite cracking the meta, requiring a couple more specific imports to do the trick, hovering in the rogue range for now. Duelist Pack Rivals of the Pharaoh would also release here, bringing a singular relevant card in Lullaby of Obedience, which can pay 2k to declare a monster, and if it's in the opponent's deck, either summons it to your field or adds it to your hand. This would be an interesting card kicked around for some mirror matchups, but would for the most part be unremarkable unless the format was so heavily centered around one specific matchup, like in the case of a Tier 0 meta, but we just left one of those, so how long would we have to wait for the next? YCS Mexico City would be the same weekend, and being the first tournament following the August ban list, the meta would be thrown into a state of flux. Blue Eyes would pull into the lead as the front runner of the meta here with nerfs across the board to its competition, playing a lineup similar to the deck's layout for Worlds, capping out at top 4. Merlantian would see a significant rise in popularity here, being a rogue to tier 3 level deck since the release of Neptipus, but with its competition out of the way could rise up to tier 2, being a solid option for the next few events. There were a lot of one-ofs that would appear in this particular top cut, and though we don't have lists for a majority of them, we do have a couple to look over. Blazing Gadget would be one of the more interesting lists we'd see, utilizing the Gadget Swarming and the Brilliant Fusion Engine to facilitate the summon of Blazing Mars, who in turn could sack the board for a 2000 damage burn. Dynamis would see a top here alongside the standard Performapal package we've come to expect for Pendulums, namely utilizing Dynamis Charge to both set scales and provide recursion for your Dynamis pieces. The most impactful of the one-offs that we have listed though would be Shiranui Zombie, taking note of Solitaire's power as a level 8 synchro enabler to enable the summon of Omega and Crystal Wing. This would be adapted into multiple decks over the next year, which we'd see soon enough. Adrian Madriz would take the event on probably the most talked about new threat, Metal Foes Clifford. Metal Foes had gotten their big break with the shift in the meta, utilizing all sorts of tools alongside their pops to gain as much value as possible. Some options included Clifford Scout, who could pay 8 to search for Monolith, pop it for a Metal Foes search, and then on the Pendulum summon bring back the Scout with Monolith to make Cyber Dragon Nova into infinity. Blackwing Gofu to provide its 2 tokens for the Metal Foe pops, and then convert itself in another level 5 like the Clifforts to make Zoltan for a toolbox of Dragon Synchros, and the newly released Odd Eyes Mirage Dragon, being a better scale 8 for Sky Iris when you don't need the Performapal synergy of Unicorn. Adding on to the ever-growing list of more minor releases, Legendary Decks 2 dropped on October 6th, bringing 3 nostalgic bait decks for Yugi, Kaiba, and Joey, but also including a few interesting promos. Ties of the Brethren could pay 2k to target a level 4 or lower, then summon 2 monsters from deck with the same type, level, and attribute but different names, locking special summons and battle phase for the turn. Ties could easily swarm out tools for use in decks of like type and attributed monsters, seeing experimentation with some strategies already in the meta, which we'll discuss soon. The other interesting promo was Eternal Soul, a continuous trap that makes Dark Magician immune to opponents' effects, can either summon a Dark Magician from hand or grave, or search a Dark Magic attack or Thousand Knives from deck once per turn, and nukes your monsters if it leaves the field. This would provide Dark Magician with something the deck desperately needed: reliable and repeatable access to the titular monster, which would actually boost Dark Magician into the ranks of a rogue deck, but not much further than that. YCS Minneapolis would be the following weekend, and though many of the decks of the previous meta took large hits on the ban list, they'd begin to creep back in here, with PK Fire specifically re-establishing itself as a meta threat. Magispector would see a new variant pop here in Ties of the Brethren, with level 3s giving access to Nekomata and Bamboku, and level 4s giving access to Yada, Kyubi, and Ogama, allowing full access to the Spell Trap suite. Infernoid would pop back up here thanks to Card Trooper popping back up, able to set up your Infernoids in grave while also cycling a card when removed. Lightsworn would once again see the top 32, fully embracing Fairy Tail Snow as a level 4 swarming body, while also stepping more into the previously popular Clownblade engine, notably on 1 Minerva. Phantom Knights would see a top completely separate from the BA cards, notably playing Gofu to act as Psyframe Lord Omega with the level 3 Phantom Knights, as well as more interesting techs in Super Hippo Carnival, able to access Performapal Hip Hippo, serving a similar purpose to how E-Telly was previously used, but at 3 copies for the level 3 body. Marcus Hayden would take the event on Metal Foes, leaning heavily into the 3 copies of Jowgen the Spiritualist, who was a popular tech option at the time for countering out Blue Eyes specifically thanks to being a pendulum summonable body whose defense is high enough to block the entire Blue Eyes normal summon lineup, with most Blue Eyes players not having an out for it in the main deck reliably. Though we've sped through a lot of sets recently, as most only included a couple of notable cards, the structure decks that released a week later would not qualify in that camp, as it would be a pair of structure decks for the first time in years, with one aimed at completely upsetting the established meta. Structure decks Yugimoto and Seto Kaiba. Release date October 21st, 2016. Set type Structure deck. Major strategies Magnet Warrior, ABC. Impact the Machine Uprising. Structure decks Yugi and Kaiba were incredibly interesting releases, as the last time we had seen a structure deck explicitly tied to a character was Merrick back in the 5Ds era, although you could make an argument that Master of Pendulum was that for Yuya just last year. As they were tied to the titular characters, many expected on initial announcement that these would be further support for both key strategies of Dark Magician and Blue Eyes, but they were actually instead a complete overhaul to key archetypes they both used back in Battle City, being Magnet Warrior for Yugi and XYZ for Kaiba. Starting with Yugi, the Magnet Warrior archetype would get an overhaul with the Electromagnet Warriors, each able to tribute themselves on the opponent's turn to summon a level 4 Magnet Warrior from deck, with Alpha searching a Magna Warrior on summon, Beta searching a Magnet Warrior on summon, and Gamma summoning a Magnet Warrior from hand on summon. These also combine together to form Berserkion the Electro-Magna Warrior, able to summon itself by banishing the 3 Electromagnets from hand, field, or grave, can banish a Magnet Warrior in grave to pop a card, and when destroyed summons the 3 Electromagnets from banishment. There was even a fusion of the 2 Magna Warriors, both Berserkion and the original Valkyrion, being Imperium Magnum the Superconductive Battlebot, who has a once per turn Omni Negate and Destroy, and if removed by an opponent's card effect summons the 2 Magna Warriors from hand or deck. Magnetic Field was a field spell that could summon a Magnet Warrior from grave if you controlled an Earth Rock once per turn, and can bounce a monster that battles with an Earth Rock but isn't destroyed. Lastly, Magnet Conversion can recur back 3 Magnet Warriors on activation, and can banish itself from grave to summon a banished Magnet Warrior. While absolutely interesting and seemingly competent, meshing well with the recent Ties of the Brethren, Magnet Warrior would suffer due to 3 major reasons. Number 1 was the reliance on the original Magnet Warrior monsters, as they were the only level 4s available to tag into with the electromagnet effects, meaning that in order to have the tag out effect be live, you had to play bricks. Number 2 was that while Berserkion was a solid presence, you had to find it to summon it, and its effect was slow and required the opponent to remove it to float, being way too reliant on the opponent not knowing how to play around it. Number 3 was that Imperion Magnum, while reasonable to get out thanks to Alpha searching its materials, was extremely resource intensive for a single negation point whose float effect requiring to hit both targets meant that you had to play at least 2 copies of Valkyrion in your deck, a card that was by all metrics a brick. And I know I said 3 reasons, but in reality, there's 4, because released at the exact same time was a very similar concept to the Magnet Warrior retrains, but done far, far better. The Kaiba structure deck focused on the XYZ unions from Battle City, giving them far better counterparts in A, B, and C, each being a union monster. Wow, it's been a while since we've heard that term, and can equip onto a light machine, each having a destruction tanking effect for its equipped monster, an effect while equipped, and an effect when sent to grave, with A making its equipped monster immune to monster effects and recurring a union from grave to hand other than itself when sent to grave, B making its monster immune to spells and searching a union when sent to grave, and C making its monster immune to traps and summoning a union from hand when sent to grave. These all facilitated the summon of ABC Dragon Buster, a fusion who could be summoned by banishing the A, B, and C from field or grave, could discard and banish a card on a quick effect, and could, on the opponent's turn only, tribute itself to summon 3 banished light machine unions with different names. Similar to Magnet Warriors, A to Z Dragon Buster Cannon was a banished contact fusion of ABC and the original XYZ that has a repeatable Omni Negate at the cost of a discard each time, and can banish itself to resummon both ABC and XYZ from banishment. Union Hanger was their new field spell, able to search a light machine union on activation and can equip an appropriate light machine union from deck to a light machine union that is summoned once per turn. Lastly, Union Scramble can summon up to 3 banished light machine normal or union monsters on activation and can banish itself from grave to recur another to hand. ABC, to put bluntly, was way better than Magnet Warriors in almost every way. Their field spell let them turbo out 2 monsters at a time, their payoff didn't need to be searched first, the payoff's removal was a quick effect, and in general, level 4 machines already have way more existing support than level 3 rocks do, like Gold and Silver Gadget for example, which in turn makes it easier to trigger things like the grave effects of the Union since you can just overlay the equipped monster to put the unions attached in grave. ABC was immediately recognized as an actually potent deck, with ABC itself being the kicker, as once you've used all the unions to go through and summon various rank 4 bosses, you cap it off with ABC to add a discarding banish and the ability to reflood the board again. There would be no clearer indication of this deck's immediate impact than YCS Liverpool a week later, where ABC would take 14 of the top 32, almost completely shunting Blue Eyes off its top of the meta position. Utilizing various tools in the rank 4 arsenal like Gold and Silver Gadget, Photon Thrasher, and various rank 4s like Gear Gigant X and Bujente Tsukiyomi, ABC would absolutely dominate the event, although notably utilizing Artifact Scythe in its lineup with Sanctum, reaching all the way to top 4 on its first outing. Lightsworn continued to both impress and depress, as it would be tied with PK Fire for the second most represented deck in top 32, bringing even more fuel onto the fire of Minerva's exclusivity. This time around, it would be new variants like a light toolbox using Brilliant Fusion to set up its various tools, as well as a zombie variant with Unizombie and Mizuki that aimed to access Omega repeatedly. DD would crack into the top 32 for the first time here, utilizing their newly released fusion Flame King Genghis to facilitate a far stronger swarming strategy than the previous version of the deck. Also utilizing Dark level 6 options like Destiny Hero Malicious and Mass Change 2 for Dark Law, in order to make Beatrice the proper way for further grave setup. Speaking of dark tools, Dark Synchro would see another top here, being the first publicly available list for the deck, and looking over this, all of the alarm bells should be going off. This deck was entirely predicated on the idea of hand looping the opponent out of the game with a combination of various tuners with Level Leader, which could eat the levels off of an Omega before banishing it to gain level advantage, or to eat down a used Trishula to use it as material for an Omega. They also use cards like DDR in order to reuse the Omega hand banish effect just to drive that point home even further. This deck was a bit of a notorious one in the meta too, as naturally you'd think the best way to counter it was Max C, but that in and of itself was an extremely dangerous gamble. An inexperienced player firing Max C on Dark Synchro the first opportune moment they could would find their hand loop problem solved by causing an entirely different problem of the opponent committing to the Max C challenge, summoning so many times that the player that fired Max C would then proceed to draw so many cards that they'd be decked out the following turn. Many players would try and play around this by going Max C in response to the first card getting looped out, but in many cases the Dark Synchro player would still have enough gas in the tank to keep going, being a massive thorn in the side of the meta at large. The only things holding the deck back from a full meta takeover was the chance of dead hands, as the deck was built on so many different 2-card interactions that it was a common sight to see a completely unplayable hand. And the complexity, as this deck had so many varying lines to go through that learning it in a sufficient manner was a massive challenge in and of itself. Star Seraph Herald would also see the top cut for the first time, using Cyber Angel Benton as a Swiss Army knife of sorts, able to search for a missing Seraph, a Herald of Perfection to summon, additional fairies for the hand in Honest or more Benton, or even Archlord Christia to add a special summon lock to the Herald board, being a solid rogue pick for the time. Thomas Rose would take the event on PK Fire, notably running a line of 3 Chaos Hunter in the main board to prevent the opponent from banishing cards, locking them out of summoning ABC, as well as Ghost Reaper being able to clean up most matches by revealing Dante, ABC, or Spirit Dragon. If you thought the ABC shook up the meta though, you haven't seen anything yet, as the last core set was just around the corner, and it would take the newly broken up meta and completely overhaul it with some of the strongest support to existing archetypes we've seen in a long time. Invasion Vengeance. Release date November 4th, 2016. Set type Core Set. Major strategies Metal Foes, Paleozoic, Frog. Impact.
Well, if it isn't froggily amazing. I messed it up!
INOV was the last core set of the year, and its job was fairly simple. Support the strategies introduced in Dark Illusion, which it handled more effectively than I think any of us at the time were ready for. Starting with Metal Foes, their support here would include Bismugear, a new scale 8 with the same scale effect, but if popped, search a Metal Foes monster in the end phase, notably being level 1, meaning it was, at the time, impossible to pendulum summon back out from the extra. Alcahest, a fusion of a Metal Foes and a normal monster that can quick effect relinquish a monster, gaining defense equal to its attack, able to use its equipped monster as material for a Metal Foes fusion. Mithrilium, a fusion of a Metal Foes and a Pendulum, able to shuffle back 2 Metal Foes cards in grave to bounce a card, floating into a Metal Foes Pendulum and face up extra or grave when sent to grave, and Full Metal Foes Fusion, a quick play fusion spell for Metal Foes. This support would change practically everything about the more pure variants of Metal Foes, giving them interaction on the opponent's turn in Alcahest, who can now be summoned on the opponent's turn with Full Metal Foes Fusion, but also in Mithrilium, who not only provides great removal, she recycles your used spells and traps to then reset with the scale effects, and her float effect also goes off when used as fusion material, making her easily the most important piece of the deck now. This would shoot Metal Foes up the ranks of the meta into a tier 1 to 2 position, able to compete solidly with ABC already in the meta. Spiral would receive a couple of interesting new pieces in Master Plan, able to search a Spiral mission, and search a Spiral Resort and a Spiral monster when sent from field to grave, and Spiral Resort, which gave your other Spiral cards targeting protection, searched a Spiral monster once per turn, and shuffles a monster from grave into deck as maintenance cost to prevent destruction. While these wouldn't do anything in the short term, Master Plan would be theorized as an insanely powerful piece for the strategy, able to search 3 cards by itself, with the caveat being the deck currently had no reliable way to summon her or get her off the field reliably, but if those 2 hurdles could be cleared, she had the potential to make Spiral a meta threat by herself. Paleozoic would receive the remainder of its cards here, being Eldonia, able to boost a monster by 500, Dinomicious, able to banish a face-up card for a discard, Morella, able to dump a trap from deck, Lincolnia, able to return a banished card to grave, and Obabinia, a rank 2 that's unaffected by monster effects, lets you activate Paleozoic traps from hand, and if it has a trap as material, can detach to search a Paleozoic trap once per turn. This would do a lot to iron out the flaws in Paleo as a deck, giving them a proactive play in Obabinia to activate from hand, as well as better Paleos in Dinomicious and Morella. But to say this was all they received would be disingenuous, as while this was all the archetypal support they got, there was also another Exceed released here that should be talked about with them. Totally awesome. TCG localization at the time was a fucking joke. Is an Aqua locked rank 2 that can detach in the standby phase to summon a frog from deck, can once per turn tribute an Aqua for an Omni Negate and destroy, then you can set that card to your field, and if sent to grave, recurs back a water monster. This card would be a massive meta shifter, as with it, Paleozoic had an Omni Negate it could access thanks to the entire archetype being Aqua level 2s. In addition to a perfect rank 2 engine it can now access for going first plays, being that of Frog. In addition, Totali's Omni Negate didn't require materials, meaning that by cheating it out with Bahamut Shark you could tribute itself for its Omni Negate effect, then put it back in extra with its recursion, meaning that not only was it a rank 2 threat, but any deck with Bahamut Shark access could also use it, which we'd see the implications of with the upcoming YCSs. Doki Doki can discard a rock to summon another from deck with the same level and attribute, being a decent option for Magnet Warriors for now, but would be far more useful in a couple of years. Mare was a level 7 tuner that could lower its level by 1 to summon a level 1 token, being an extremely interesting combo enabler when used with Yazi, and would get far more popular with the next era of the game. Starving Venom Fusion Dragon would be the fourth of the mechanic dragons, taking 2 dark monsters on the field, gains the attack of an opponent's special summon monster on fusion summon, and can copy a level 5 or higher name and effect for a turn, and nukes the opponent's special summoned monsters when destroyed. This would be notably the weakest of the 4 dragons for now, as the only real card that could make it without sinking too many resources was Super Poly, which was currently banned, leaving Starving Venom in a weird spot for now. Meteor Black Comet Dragon is a fusion of a level 7 Red Eyes and a level 6 dragon, can dump a Red Eyes from deck on summon to burn for half its original attack, and revives a normal monster when sent to grave, and Red Eyes Insight dumps a Red Eyes monster from deck to search another Red Eye spell trap. These two would help form an FTK of sorts for Red Eyes, specifically in that Meteor summon with Red Eyes Fusion, and then 2 copies of Inferno Fire Blast would be 8200 damage, which while an extremely inconsistent FTK thanks to Inferno Fire Blast not being searchable, was still one to be aware of. Denglong, First of the Yang Zing, is a level 5 synchro that searches a Yang Zing card on summon, can dump a worm to copy its level, and floats into a Yang Zing when it leaves field. This first effect would standardly be used to search their new counter trap 9 Pillars, which by popping a Yang Zing at the end of its effect was an Omni Negate and shuffle back, making Denglong a level 5 synchro with a generic Omni Negate, which would be attractive for many strategies. Vermilion Dragon Mech was a TCG exclusive level 9 synchro that could banish a tuner and grave to pop a card, and if destroyed by card effect, recur to banish tuner, being a solid option for Blue Eyes. Lastly, Dimensional Barrier could lock the summon and effects of either rituals, fusions, synchros, exceeds, or pendulums for a turn, being an extremely powerful floodgate to an entire mechanic of your choosing, but was also seen as problematic immediately because it listed all of the mechanics it hit, meaning that if a new mechanic came up within a year, as many expected would happen as we were coming up on the 3-year mark since Pendulums, Barrier wouldn't affect it. Still, for now, it was an extremely useful floodgate, which would find its way into various decks immediately. YCS Rio would be a week later, and though ABC was clearly still the top dog in the format off of this, a shakeup had happened with Metal Foes rising up the ladder. With the additions of Alcahest and Mithrilium, Metal Foes had ditched some of the more niche options in its arsenal for more standard pendulum pieces like the Magispector package and Luster Pendulum, turning it into the go-to pendulum deck of the format. Painful Decision was also starting to get more popular in the deck for accessing basically whatever scale you needed, as now with Mithrilium the dump scale wasn't gone for good, as you could just float back into it later or cycle it back to the deck for her bounce effect. Paleozoic would find its first top here too, utilizing the frogs as an engine to access rank 2s on the first turn, either for Toad, backed up by a series of traps, or for Opabinia to churn out the Paleos on the first turn without needing to set them first. As the deck was super reliant on traps in the first place, it made sense that its lineup would be chock full of floodgates and counters to top strategies, such as Anti-Spell, Floodgate Trap Hole, Quaking Mirror Force, and Barrier Statue of the Torrent. Most interesting here was Waboku, which served the purpose of being protection for your summoned Paleos, as well as being chainable to any removal, which in turn also triggered a Paleo Engrave, making it an incredibly important inclusion. Galileo de Obaldia, the 2010s Worlds winner, would take the event on ABC, with the only real change to the deck being the inclusion of Dimensional Barrier, as ABC was one of the best decks to utilize it since it could pivot between fusions and exceeds better than some other strategies. This would lead us into the last set of the year, and with so much changing so fast, many were curious if the last set could bring another shakeup before the year closed out. Destiny Soldiers. Release date, November 18th, 2016. Set type, deck building set. Major strategies, Destiny Hero, Abyss Actor, Dark Lord. Impact, 1 new rogue level threat. Destiny Soldiers was the last set of the year, bringing 3 dark attribute archetypes to try and shake things up one last time. Abyss Actor would be the first of these, being a series of pendulums focused around their spells, the Abyss scripts, which had different effects based on whether they're activated or destroyed while set, which unfortunately were not successful at the time in the slightest, even as pieces in a pendulum pile. Destiny Hero would be the second of these, bringing new support to the strategy focused around their cards Aster Phoenix used in the recent stint of the Arc 5 anime. Drill Dark can summon a D-Hero from hand on summon with attack less or equal to itself and deals piercing. Dark Angel can discard itself if you have 3 or more D-Heroes in grave to summon a D-Hero from grave to the opponent's board, negating and destroying any spells activated by its controller, and can banish itself and another D-Hero from grave in your standby phase to have both players stack a normal spell from deck on top of their deck. Celestial can pop an opponent's face-up spell when it attacks to burn for 500, and can banish itself and another D-Hero while you have no cards in hand to draw 2. And Dystopia is a fusion of 2 D heroes that can burn for half of a level 4 lower D hero's attack in grave on summon, and can turn its attack back to normal if changed to pop a card on field on a quick effect. Needless to say, this support lacked a lot of focus, but it would give Hero a couple of interesting tools for the future to play around with, not really changing the strategy's position for now. Lastly, and most importantly, were the Dark Lords, most of which shared an effect to pay 1000 life on quick effect to copy a Dark Lord spell trap effect from grave, then shuffled it back into deck. Ixchel could discard herself and another Dark Lord card to draw 2, Texcatlipoca could discard itself to prevent the destruction of Dark Lord monsters, Nastin could discard 2 other Dark Lord cards to summon itself from hand, and Amdust could discard itself and another Dark Lord to recur a Dark Lord card. Morningstar was the only one here without the copy effect, able to summon Dark Lords from deck on tribute summon up to the number of effect monsters the opponent had targeting protection while you controlled another Dark Lord, and can mill cards up to the number of Dark Lords you control to gain 500 for each Dark Lord card milled that way. As for their spell traps, Banishment searched a Dark Lord card, Contact revived a Dark Lord, Rebellion could send a Dark Lord from hand or field to grave to pop a card, and Enchantment could do the same to Brain Con a monster for the turn, with the traps notably skipping their costs if used by the Dark Lord copy effect. This would be a bold departure from the GX era cards, although Desire and Superbia specifically would also be useful for this new version of the deck, giving more swarming and easy spot removal for the strategy. Though it was a competent deck for sure, Dark Lord being a deck of high level monsters with only 2 reliable ways to get one on field initially left the deck in a position of bricking a lot, which in turn meant that for now, Dark Lord would be relegated to the ever-growing gallery of rogue level decks. YCS Anaheim would follow 2 weeks later, and with the new pool of cards from INOV, new strategies would start popping up. Toad and its consequences would result in the appearance of not only Mermail, taking advantage of the new Bahamut Shark target to regain some of its relevance lost with the shuffling of the meta, but also in, of all places, Hero. Because Bahamut Shark could access Toad, the deck had resorted back to an old favorite, being Bubble Man, as it could be half of a Bahamut Shark very easily either with another copy of itself or with 10 Goldfish, which had always been considered for a Shadow Mist enabler but never really had a reason to be played over something like Goblinburg until now. As such, the end board of Dark Claw and Toad would become more and more common as Hero rose back into a tier 3 position in the meta. Dark Lord would take 2 top spots on its first outing, being able to mitigate its bricks in a Swiss setting but crumbling a bit in single elimination, falling out in top 32. Though notably playing 3 copies of Dark Lord Zerato from Phantom Darkness as a 1 tribute board nuke. Yang Xing would see a top here mostly thanks to Denglong in addition to the Metal Foes, enabling the Yang Xing float effects in a major way, which in turn allowed for the deck to set up both Denglong and Zephyr Nui, which resulted in multiple 9 pillars to form a defensive line. Elvis Vu would take the event on ABC, utilizing the Brilliant Fusion engine as a way to flood board, and to access the ABC pieces on the light dump for easier access to the Fusion ABC itself. YCS Bokum would be 2 weeks later, being the last YCS of the year, and with it we'd see the meta actually balance out again between its top 4 decks, being that of ABC, Metal Foes, Paleozoic, and Hero. Paleo had shown the most growth here over time since release, as it had trimmed its monster and spell count down to about as low as it could go, being that of a Frog Engine, Maxi, and Desires, leaving the rest of the deck to be Impact Traps and Paleos, with probably the most interesting pivot here being that of Reckless Greed, filling a similar niche to how it was used back in Dark World to stack multiple together without getting multiple of the drawback. Only this time it could also revive a Paleo when you used it. Awesome Performage Lightsworn would be a pile of pile decks, combining the previous Lightsworn game plan with that of using 10 Goldfish as half of Bahamut Shark, with the other half usually being Gigabyte, which was still searchable with King of the Feral Imps and easy to summon between the Performages and Minerva. Zombie would take the turn going down the hand loop trail we all expected, utilizing the Sheer Nui engine in addition to various level 1 and 2 tuner options alongside Beast of the Pharaoh to loop through their Omega and Trishula lines, with Beast of the Pharaoh able to revive Zombie Master when sent for a Synchro Summon, Master then being able to discard to revive Beast, and then with a level 1 tuner makes Omega or a level 2 makes Trishula, reviving the Master with Beast to do it all over again. Billy Break would take the event on Metal Foes, marking his 4th YCS win, which at the time made him the player with the most total YCS wins, which would be his last YCS win as he would retire from the competitive side of the game to work for Konami in their development of the game sometime after August of 2017. And with that, 2016 Yu-Gi-Oh! Would come to an end, but what an insanely packed year it was. We'd seen the rise and immediate fall of a Tier 0 Titan, multiple formats with at least 4 decks vying for the top position, and so many shifts in the game that it's hard to believe it all happened within a single year. But unfortunately, a storm was coming. We were about to enter 2017, and with it would come more than just a new Tier 0 menace. It would also bring a shift that many would doomcry as the end of Yu-Gi-Oh as we knew it. But I mean, come on, they've said that about every new mechanic so far. How bad could it possibly be? A huge extra special shout out to my Dark Law level patrons, Dammit Marco, Jukes, Misaden, NTB Yugioh, Otaku GamerX, and Prinrin, as well as all of my other patrons over on patreon.com. If you'd like to support the channel, consider following me on Patreon, where support tiers start at as little as $1 and you get access to all my videos a day early. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel, that way you don't miss out on any future videos. Every subscription helps out more than you think. Thank you all again, and I'll see you next time.